Hello, fellow Sapiens. A quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're curled beneath the blankets after a long day, walking under slow-moving stars, or simply filling the stillness with something thoughtful, this space is for you. Because tonight, we're stepping into the long and quiet history of the tools that helped us survive the Ice Age. This is slow science for weary minds and curious hearts. This is the untold story of how early humans, across hundreds of thousands of years, turned stone, bone, and firelight into instruments of survival. It's a story stitched together from flint fragments, bone needles, and ash-darkened hearths, each one an echo from a time before memory. But these weren't inventions in the modern sense. Not sudden bursts of brilliance. They were slow, accidental, often silent. Not machines of progress, but quiet solutions to cold, hunger, and time. And if you're someone who finds wonder in lost histories and the quiet patience of our ancestors, consider tapping like and subscribe. It helps this kind of calm storytelling reach others on their own late-night journeys. Oh, and where are you listening from? What time is it, right now, wherever you are? If you feel like sharing, drop it in the comments. It's a quiet way we remember we're not alone in the listening. Also, feel free to fall asleep. Chapters are marked below in the description. Now, let us begin with a shard in the dust. The history of Ice Age tools does not begin with fire-hardened spears or clever traps. It begins with something quieter, something smaller, a sharp edge, a broken rock, a shard in the dust. This story begins not with a triumph, but with a question. Somewhere in East Africa, more than 2 million years ago, a hand closed around a fragment of stone, jagged, sharp, and different. And with that moment, something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but over thousands of lifetimes, this simple act, the choosing of a fractured rock, became a turning point in the long and patient evolution of human survival. Because before we had language, before fire warmed our nights, even before we were fully human in the way we understand it today, we shaped the world with tools. And those tools began with the Oldowan. The Oldowan toolkit, named after the Olduvai Gorge where some of the earliest examples were found, is among the oldest known evidence of tool-making in the human lineage. Dated to around 2.6 million years ago, these tools were remarkably simple, yet deeply consequential. They include flakes, struck from larger stones, cores, the chunks of rock left behind, and pounding stones, used not for cutting but for smashing, likely bone or perhaps nuts. At first glance, they might not look like much. Many Oldowan artifacts resemble ordinary rocks, and that very ambiguity has challenged archaeologists for decades. What separates a tool from a stone? A question of intention, of use, of context. But when examined closely, subtle clues emerge, repeated flake scars, patterns of wear, and signs of deliberate strike angles. And this raises another quiet mystery. How did early hominins know which rocks to break? And how did they recognize, over time, that a flake's edge could cut? These early tools were not standardized. There was no blueprint, no design etched into memory. Each flake was unique. Some likely accidental, others chosen. Yet over time, preferences emerged. Certain types of stone, quartzite, basalt, chert, became favoured, perhaps because they fractured more predictably. This suggests that the hominins who used them weren't merely bashing stones together at random. They were learning, observing, and perhaps even teaching. But what would they have done with such tools? The answer lies not just in the tools themselves, but in what surrounds them. Scattered near Oldowan sites, archaeologists have found fossilised bones, some bearing cut marks. Thin incisions etched into ancient animal remains, sometimes overlapping with tooth marks from predators, sometimes positioned at joints or tendon attachments. These are the forensic shadows of tool use. It is here that we begin to see not just survival, but strategy. Because these marks suggest that early humans, or their ancestors, were not always the hunters. Often, they were the scavengers, arriving after the predator had left, using stone flakes to remove scraps of meat, or to crack long bones for the marrow inside. And so, we ask the quiet but profound question, What does it mean that the earliest tools were not weapons of conquest, but instruments of persistence? Over time, these simple tools began to tell a more complex story, not just about the materials themselves, but about the minds behind them. The oldest known Oldowan tools have been uncovered in sites such as Gona and Buri in Ethiopia, as well as the famous Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. Across these places, scattered across the vast East African Rift Valley, a pattern emerges. Not only do we find tools, but we also find bones, often from large animals like antelope, buffalo, or even ancient elephant ancestors. But it is the placement of these bones, the cut of the marks, and their proximity to stone tools that begins to reveal intention. In one site near Buri, for example, fossilized hippo bones bear unmistakable incisions, sharp slices at tendons and joints, followed by smashing blows to extract the marrow. The pattern is not chaotic. It's targeted. It speaks of memory. Perhaps not in the way we think of memory today, but in a kind of embodied understanding, a recognition of where to strike, what to remove, what to leave. And so we begin to wonder, how does knowledge pass between beings without words? What kind of memory survives without writing? We cannot know for certain whether these early hominins, likely Australopithecus or early Homo species, taught each other directly. But in the quiet language of imitation, in the repetition of gestures over time, something passed forward, something endured. These patterns, scattered across thousands of kilometers and hundreds of thousands of years, suggest more than accident. They suggest that by 2.6 million years ago, the use of tools was not just present, it was persistent. And still, we are speaking of flakes, tiny edges, slivers of sharpness broken from a core. Imagine holding one in your hand, not shaped like a knife, not balanced like a spear, just a fragment, a thumb-sized wedge of stone, thin enough to cut through hide or scrape meat from bone. If you pressed it to your finger today, it would still slice your skin. These edges, these small fractured flashes of intention, represent the first step in a long winding journey of invention. And while they seem crude from the vantage point of modern tools, they represent a fundamental leap, the transformation of the environment through an idea. Because to break a stone and keep the shard is not just an action, it's a recognition that the world can be altered, that the shape of something is not fixed, that a broken thing can have a new purpose. And perhaps this is the quiet genius of the Oldowan. Not that the tools were complex, but that they worked, that they endured, that they were, in their time, enough. Not for comfort, not for dominance, but for survival. And survival, as it turns out, is an ancient art. To imagine an Oldowan site is to step into a world both alien and eerily familiar. There are no permanent shelters, no fire circles, no bones arranged with purpose beyond the feeding of hunger. But there are choices, and in those choices, we glimpse minds at work. Not our minds, perhaps, but minds shaped by necessity, memory, and touch. At sites like Lokalale in Kenya, archaeologists have found clusters of stone flakes with surprising regularity, cores struck from multiple angles, flakes removed in sequences that hint at a rhythm not unlike practice. And this raises another question. When does action become craft? The process of knapping, even at its simplest level, is not passive. It requires a kind of anticipation. A strike must be aimed with knowledge of where the force will travel. Too shallow, and the flake will be useless. Too hard, and the core may shatter. These early flint knappers, though we use that word cautiously, were not just breaking rocks. They were learning what stone could do. More importantly, they were learning what their own hands could do to stone. And that knowledge, once discovered, became an extension of the body. A flake edge did not simply replace a tooth or a claw, it added something new. It allowed for choices in how to cut, where to strike, how to shape. The tool did not mimic nature. It bent it. Even more curious is where these tools are found. Often, Oldowan sites are located at the edges of rivers or along ancient lake beds. Not because water was scarce, but because water revealed stone. Seasonal floods would scour the land, exposing cobbles of volcanic basalt or fine-grained quartzite. These were not always abundant nearby, which suggests that early tool users didn't just wait for good stone, They remembered where it could be found. Some researchers propose that they may have carried cores with them, pockets of potential, to new sites. Others believe that raw materials were transported short distances, used, and abandoned. We can't know for sure, but what we can infer is that the landscape mattered. The environment was not simply a backdrop, it was a source, a challenge, and a canvas. And perhaps this is what truly defines a tool, not just that it performs a function, but that it is chosen. That someone saw in a nondescript rock the possibility of transformation. We might call it cognition, but perhaps it is something even more fundamental. Awareness. The awareness that a hard edge can break softer things. That bone yields to stone. That meat, sinew, and skin can be removed by force applied in the right place. That the world, when looked at differently, can be carved open. This is not intelligence as we know it, but it is a kind of seeing, a kind of touch, a slow and ancient form of attention, and attention, over enough time, becomes tradition. The tools themselves are silent, but the bones, remember, scattered across the floors of ancient lake margins and open-air clearings, they tell us what the stones cannot. Rib cages split apart, femurs smashed at their thickest ends, mandibles marked with fine incisions, often right where muscle once clung. These are not the leftovers of predators. They are the fingerprints of a different kind of hunger. At a site called Kangera South, near Lake Victoria in Kenya, archaeologists uncovered layers of fossils dating back almost 2 million years. Among them, gazelle, wildebeest, antelope, bones bearing cut marks that could only have come from stone tools, but not randomly. The cuts followed patterns. Slices along tendons, scrapes near joints, crushing blows at marrow-rich shafts. This is where the science becomes forensic. To understand how these early tools were used, researchers examined the marks under microscopes. They looked at the width of each incision, the angle of the cut, the force implied by a crack or fracture. They compared these to experiments with recreated Oldowan flakes on fresh animal carcasses, and what they found was subtle but persuasive, evidence not just of tool use, but of deliberate sequences. Meat was removed first, then tendons. Then the bones were broken. This implies not chaos but order, not mere chance but memory. But whose memory? We do not know who made the Oldowan tools. The leading candidates are early members of our genus, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, but perhaps also late Australopithecus species. The fossil record here is incomplete. The tools do not lie directly beside the bones of their makers. The distance between tool and hand remains frustratingly large. Still, the association is compelling, and so is the behaviour, because these tools were not likely used in hunting. The animals were too large, the technology too simple. What seems more likely is a kind of patient opportunism, a hominin scanning the savannah for vultures, waiting at a distance while lions fed, circling in silence until it was safe to approach. Then, quickly, cutting meat from what remained, cracking bones with hammerstones to extract the rich fatty marrow, the most calorie-dense food available. In this way, the earliest tool users were not the top of the food chain. They were specialists in what predators left behind. It may sound unimpressive, but it wasn't, because to scavenge effectively in the Pleistocene was no small feat. It meant tracking, waiting, timing. It meant knowing which parts of an animal were worth the risk. And it meant having the tools, however simple, to access them. A lion leaves behind bones. A hominin with a flake finds dinner. This, too, is survival, not through strength, but through adaptation, not through domination, but through precision. And this subtle shift, from acting on instinct to acting with foresight, is perhaps the first quiet movement towards something we might one day call culture, even if it began with a single cut. What begins with a broken rock does not end with one. Over the next few 100,000 years, the Oldowan tradition would spread, eastward across Africa, south into the grassy highlands, and north into the Levant and parts of southern Asia. At sites like Dmanisi in Georgia, dated to nearly 1.8 million years ago, similar flakes and cores have been found alongside early hominin remains. This suggests not just invention, but movement, not just discovery, but continuity. The toolkit itself remained relatively unchanged for nearly 1 million years. That longevity is remarkable. In our modern world, where innovation moves at the speed of months and upgrades define our sense of progress, the idea of using the same method of flake production for tens of thousands of generations may feel alien, but perhaps it also reminds us of something deeper, that when a solution works, when it fits the needs of a body and a landscape, change is not always required. What changed was us. The hand that struck the stone became steadier. The eye that chose a cobble became more discerning. The mind that recognized a usable edge began to anticipate its creation. And through this long patience, the act of tool-making became more than instinct. It became an inheritance. Not through genes alone, but through gestures. An adult hunched by a riverbank, selecting the right stone. A younger figure watching, imitating, trying, failing. A flake shatters off too shallow. Another splits at the wrong point. But eventually, a usable edge. And with it, the first taste of learning through doing. It's here, in the dusty cradle of East Africa, that we find the roots not just of survival, but of teaching. And that may be the most profound legacy of all. Because tools, by themselves, do not remember. But a practice, repeated often enough, becomes memory in the muscles. It becomes a rhythm in the hands, a whisper passed down not in words but in action. What the archaeological record cannot show us, we can still feel. This was the beginning of tradition. Not rituals, not gods, but continuity. A shard of stone, a cut of meat, a bone, cracked for marrow. The rhythm of life, held together by sharpness, silence, and skill. And this, in the end, is where the entire history of Ice Age tools begins. Not with fire or spears or dramatic hunts, but with a quiet, careful act, a single stone flake pulled from a core, sharp enough to open the body of a beast, an edge against time. A gesture made in hunger, repeated in memory, and carried forward across the ages. The haunting question, then, is not how we learned to survive, but how survival became a story we could teach. And in that passing down of gestures, stone to hand, edge to bone, something subtle, yet astonishing, began to stir. The older one tools had served their purpose. But over time, a new form emerged. Not suddenly, not like a spark leaping from dry tinder, but gradually, patiently, as if the stones themselves had started to remember the hands that shaped them. This was the beginning of what archaeologists call the Acheulean. Roughly 1.7 million years ago, a new type of stone tool appeared across the landscapes of Africa. Unlike the scattered flakes and cores of the older one, these new implements were deliberate, symmetrical, and carefully crafted. Often shaped on both faces. Often teardrop-shaped. These were not fragments of accidents. They were the first signs of vision. And at the heart of this quiet revolution was a hominin whose shadow stretches long across the prehistoric world. Homo erectus. Standing taller than its ancestors, with a larger brain and a more modern gait, Homo erectus is often described as one of our earliest true travellers. Fossils appear from Kenya to Georgia, from India to Java. This species crossed continents, adapted to new ecologies, and left behind a new kind of artifact in its wake, the Acheulean hand axe. To the untrained eye, it may seem unimpressive. A flattened oval chipped into shape, its edges sharp and often symmetrical. But it is that symmetry, that intention, that marks the shift. These tools were not merely functional, they were designed, and that raises a strange and beautiful question. What kind of mind begins to shape stone with an image in mind? At sites like Konso in Ethiopia, Acheulean hand axes appear in long sequences, spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Over that vast stretch of time, their shapes evolve, becoming thinner, more balanced, more refined. But the essence remains. The hand axe, in all its quiet persistence, endures as one of the longest used tools in the human story. Some are small enough to fit neatly in a hand. Others span nearly a foot, too large for ordinary tasks. Were they ceremonial? Symbols? Teaching tools? We cannot say. But the fact that they exist at all, and in such numbers, across such distances, suggests more than utility. It suggests memory and repetition, because unlike flakes, which emerge from the act of breaking, a hand axe is shaped. Its form requires planning. The flint napper must see not just the stone's surface, but its depth. Each strike removes material. Each choice influences the next. And this process, known today as bifacial knapping, implies something extraordinary. Foresight. The maker must imagine the tool before it is complete. And this, perhaps more than any single invention, is what begins to separate tools from technique and technique from thought. Because somewhere in this slow revolution of stone, intention took root. Symmetry, in itself, is not survival. No animal is hunted more efficiently because the tool is beautiful. No marrow is richer for having been split with precision. And yet, symmetry appears again and again in Acheulean hand axes. Across regions, across generations, across species, it invites a simple but profound question. Why? The answer may lie in repetition. The Acheulean tools were not just knapped into shape, they were standardized. Not perfectly, of course. Each hand axe has its own signature, its own small differences. But over time, patterns emerge, preferred shapes, balanced profiles, edges aligned with central spines. The tools begin to echo one another, even when separated by continents. This is not the randomness of necessity. This is something else. It is as if the image of the hand axe, the idea of it, was being held somewhere before the stone was ever touched. At the site of Boxgrove in England, dated to around 500,000 years ago, archaeologists discovered a workshop floor littered with flakes and half-finished tools. Some hand axes had been discarded mid-process, others were near perfect. And in this scattered debris a story emerges, not just of use, but of practice, of trial, of correction, perhaps even of teaching. These stones become more than objects, they become expressions of thought. And yet, there's a humility we must hold on to here. We cannot project our modern minds too deeply into these ancient hands. There was no written language, no blueprint, no architectural plan, but there was something enduring, something that passed from one body to another, through demonstration, repetition, and memory. Even today, modern flint knappers who replicate Acheulean tools describe a sensation that is part rhythm, part instinct. The hands learn to listen to the stone. Each strike builds upon the last, and slowly a shape begins to emerge. What's astonishing is that the shape is not required. An irregular core can still cut meat. A sharp flake still serves its purpose. But the Acheulean hand axe goes beyond that. It's more than sharp. It's symmetrical, balanced, even elegant. So what purpose does symmetry serve? Some researchers suggest it may have had social meaning, that a well-made hand axe could signal competence, strength, or even mating fitness. Others point to efficiency. A balanced tool might be easier to handle, or to resharpen. Or perhaps it was simply the product of habit. Once a technique is learned, its form replicates itself. But no matter the reason, the result is clear. These were not one-time inventions. They were traditions. Traditions that held their form across ice ages and migrations. Traditions that lasted longer than any civilization we've ever built. And that persistence, that whispering echo from hand to hand, speaks of a different kind of revolution. One not of speed or innovation, but of commitment. A slow revolution, a quiet one, but a revolution nonetheless. To shape a tool with symmetry is one thing. To imagine it beforehand is another. The Acheulean hand axe, in all its deliberate precision, hints at a deeper layer of cognition. It suggests that the maker wasn't just responding to the stone in front of them, but working toward a mental goal. Not a vague desire for sharpness, but a specific shape, a form held in memory, perhaps even in imagination. This is what some researchers call a mental template. The idea that, long before drawing or writing or architecture, early humans could visualize a form that did not yet exist, and then bring it into being through action. Not once, but again, and again, and again. This is not a claim made lightly. The archaeological record cannot tell us what thoughts passed through an ancient mind. It cannot confirm my intention, but it can reveal patterns, and when hand axes appear with the same proportions across time and space, we are left to wonder. What kind of mind remembers form without words? At the site of Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, nearly 800,000 years old, hand axes appear with remarkable consistency, as if the concept of hand axe had stabilized into a kind of pre-linguistic memory, not just how to make it, but what it was supposed to be. And this raises a subtle but fascinating distinction. The difference between making something and knowing what it is you are making. A chimpanzee can crack a nut with a rock, a crow can bend a wire into a hook, but neither returns to the same shape with ritual precision. Neither holds a visual pattern across generations. In the Acheulean, we begin to see this emergence, a shaping not only of tools but of mind. The hand axe becomes a mirror, not of the face, but of thought. Because to maintain a mental template, especially over vast time and geography, implies a kind of cultural memory, one not written in words, but etched into bodies. Hands that remember angles, eyes that gauge symmetry, children who learn by watching, adults who correct with gestures, and slowly, a kind of pre-linguistic consensus begins to form. This tool should look like this, not because of instinct, but because of tradition. This is the quiet revolution unfolding beneath the surface. Not a sudden leap in intelligence, but a gradual layering of skill, memory, and intention. A sediment of thought, compacted into generations, until even the stones begin to hold our reflection. And still, the question remains, was it art? Was it language? Was it simply utility made efficiently? Or was it something even more elusive? A flicker of self-awareness, shaped not in words, but in stone. Perhaps the most haunting feature of the Acheulean tradition is its silence. These tools do not speak in the way we understand language. They do not bear inscriptions, or names, or instructions. But they are not mute. They speak through their repetition, their form, their presence across time. And what they suggest is unsettling in its beauty. At places like Sapien in South Africa, hundreds of hand axes have been unearthed, some discarded after a flaw, others worn smooth from use. A few are so refined that they seem almost impractical, too large to carry, too thin to endure pressure. Their symmetry feels excessive, beyond what survival demands. So what does that tell us? It tells us that these tools were not always about function, at least, not only. Some may have been made to be seen, to be held, to be shared, not as language, but perhaps as demonstration, or pride, or ritual, and that complicates the picture of early humans. Because it's one thing to survive, it's another to shape beauty into the act. When researchers compare Acheulean hand axes across sites, from Europe to India to East Africa, the similarities are uncanny. Not identical, of course, but similar enough to suggest shared concepts, shared expectations. It's as though the form itself travelled, not through maps, not through instruction, but through memory. Memory stored in bodies, a hand that learns to chip from watching another, a gesture passed from ancestor to child. Not all hominins produced Acheulean tools. In fact, even after their emergence, older one-style tools continued to appear. Simple flakes, unshaped cores. The Acheulean was not a universal revolution, but where it took hold it left a lasting trace, and that trace grows clearer with each excavation. At a site in Kenya, a cache of hand axes was found buried together, some pristine, some broken. No animal bones nearby, no hearths, just the tools. Laid down, it seems, with no immediate purpose. Could they have been offerings? Stockpiles? We don't know. But they suggest that, even then, tools had begun to take on meaning beyond the task. They were objects of continuity, and continuity, like language, is a structure built from repetition. What makes this so moving is that we are not speaking of people with cities, or writing, or even speech as we know it. We are speaking of beings who lived by rivers, ate what they could gather or scavenge, and yet left behind artifacts of intentional, persistent form. Not random, not chaotic, but deliberate. And when you hold one today, cool in your palm, edges worn by time, you are holding not just a tool, but a decision, a shape that someone, somewhere, once chose to make. The revolution, if we can call it that, was almost invisible. No cities rose, no monuments were carved, no new species emerged overnight. And yet, something changed between the flake and the biface, something that left a permanent mark on the human story. Because the Acheulean hand axe is more than a tool. It is a turning point in how our ancestors related to the world and to the future. By creating an object that held form across space and time, early humans began to do something extraordinary. They shaped an idea that could outlive the individual. The hand axe became a bridge, from thought to stone, from gesture to memory, from survival to continuity, and in that continuity, we begin to glimpse the early contours of culture, not culture as art galleries or epics or temples, but culture as repetition with intention. The act of doing something the same way, not just because it works, but because it means something, because it connects you to those who came before, and those who might come after. It is this shift, from instinct to imitation, from reaction to planning, that makes the Acheulean so quietly profound. Imagine a world where nothing is written down, no instructions, no diagrams, no explanations, only bodies, movements, stone, and yet the shape persists. Generation after generation, the hand axe reappears, chipped, refined, symmetrical. It is held in the hands of those who never met its original makers, and still, somehow, they know what it's for, or at least what it ought to be. This, perhaps, is the earliest form of memory outside the brain, not in stories, not in genes, but in objects. The hand axe carries memory in its form, and that memory reshapes the mind that touches it. This is what archaeologists mean when they talk about a cognitive leap. Not a sudden explosion of intelligence, but the gradual layering of capability, a scaffolding of skill and imagination built slowly across the bones of time, the mental template, the repeated gesture, the vision of a shape before it exists, and all of it held within a sliver of rock. As the Acheulean tradition continued, it would eventually be replaced by new techniques, blades, microliths, hafted tools. But nothing else would last so long, or stretch so far. For over 1 million years, the hand axe was the quiet heartbeat of human toolmaking, not because it was perfect, but because it was remembered, and this is how the quiet revolution leaves its mark, not in sudden change, but in endurance, not in brilliance, but in patience, not in invention, but in return, to the same shape, to the same movement, to the same whisper of thought, held in stone. Even as that shape endured in stone, something else began to flicker to life, less permanent, but just as transformative. Across the windswept plains of Ice Age Eurasia, as temperatures dropped and seasons grew harsher, early humans encountered not only new landscapes but new limits. Stone could cut, bone could pry, but neither could warm a body through a glacial night or keep a child from freezing before dawn. And so the question begins to glow at the centre of our journey. What changed when our ancestors learned to tend a flame? The earliest evidence for fire is difficult to interpret. Ashes dissolve, burnt wood decays, even charred bone can be mistaken for natural exposure. But here and there, in scattered sites stretching across nearly 2 million years, the clues begin to gather like coals. At Kubifora in Kenya, reddened soil layers suggest heat exposure around 1.5 million years ago. At Chesawanya, burned clay nodules hint at temperatures unlikely to occur without control. The traces are faint, the signal is weak, but it grows stronger with time. By around 700 to 800,000 years ago, the story becomes harder to dismiss. At Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, scientists uncovered clusters of burned flint, wood charcoal, and charred seeds, all concentrated near stone tools and butchered animal remains. The spatial patterns suggest something new, not random wildfires, but fire brought into camp. Fire kept, and with that change came others, because fire, once tamed, does more than warm the body. It alters the entire rhythm of human life. It extends the day. It softens food. It hardens tools. And, perhaps most importantly, it gathers people. A flame is not just heat. It is a centre, a circle, a place where others draw close, to share meat, to speak, if speech was possible, or simply to sit, wrapped in shadow and flickering light. From a forensic perspective, fire becomes visible in 2 key ways: burned bone and blackened earth, layered in cave floors, embedded in sediments. When bones are burned, they often warp or crack in predictable ways. Their coloration changes, their density shifts. And when these patterns are found beneath layers of occupation, scientists begin to infer something remarkable. Not just the use of fire, but the reuse of fire spots. The return to hearths. A hearth is not a random burn mark, it's a chosen place, a memory etched into earth. And this act, choosing where to place flame, is no small decision. Because fire, while powerful, is dangerous. It can destroy as easily as it protects. To keep it near is to live beside risk. Which means at some point, our ancestors decided the risk was worth it. And so, fire became not just a force of nature, but a partner in survival. We begin to find more than ashes. We find patterns. In sites like Terra Amata on the southern coast of France, archaeologists have uncovered what may be some of the earliest constructed hearths. Circular arrangements of stones, surrounded by charcoal, embedded deep in the soil of ancient beach shelters. Though interpretations differ, the presence of repeated burn layers within defined spaces suggests more than happenstance. It suggests return, it suggests habit, and habit, over time, becomes home. In the caves of Zhoukoudian, near modern-day Beijing, the story becomes even more layered. Here, inside what was once a shelter for Homo erectus, researchers found thick bands of ash interspersed with burned bones and stone tools, accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years. Some scientists argue these were the remnants of hearths, used again and again. Others debate whether the ash drifted in from outside. The evidence is not unanimous, but the question itself reveals something important. Our ancestors were close enough to fire for its signature to be burned into the places they slept. And that proximity changes everything. Fire transforms meat, making it safer, softer, easier to digest. It deters predators. It thaws frozen limbs. But it also does something subtler. It anchors a place. A hearth is not just where food is cooked. It is where time slows down. Imagine sitting before it. A wind howls beyond the cave mouth. Cold breath spills across the land. But here, near the flame, warmth pulses against skin. Bones dry, tools glint in firelight. And within that glow, a small circle of memory begins to form. For archaeologists, this memory is preserved in burnt bone. When bones are exposed to direct heat, especially in open fires, they show signs of calcination, turning white, brittle, warped. In sites like Beech's Pit in England, these clues appear in clusters, often surrounded by flint tools and hammerstones. The association is not random. It implies that animals were butchered, cooked, and consumed by firelight. Some of the bones belong to red deer, others to wild cattle, a few even to smaller game. And while we cannot know what was said, or even if words were yet spoken, we can infer that food was shared. That time was spent near the heat, and perhaps that's the most vital role fire came to play, not just in the belly, but in the space between bodies, between moments, between tasks, because once night fell, and the world outside grew dark and cold, the fire offered something rare in the prehistoric world, a reason to stop moving, to sit, to stay, to wait. This stillness was new, and in that stillness, something else began to spark, not just warmth, but awareness. The presence of fire did more than change the environment, it changed the mind that lived beside it, because when the sun dipped below the horizon, and the landscape faded into cold and shadow, those without fire had little choice but to rest, to hide, or to sleep. But those with fire could remain awake. They could stay warm. They could think. And this raises a compelling question. What happens to a brain that no longer shuts down with the dark? Night, for much of evolutionary history, was a time of risk. Predators hunted in darkness. The cold reached its peak just before dawn. But with fire, the night became something new. A window of opportunity. Not just to extend the day, but to create a new kind of time. Fire time. Unlike the busy daylight hours, fire time was slower. There was no hunting, no foraging, no movement across great distances. It was a time of stillness, of reflection, of social connection, and perhaps even of storytelling. Of course, we must be careful. The evidence for speech at this stage remains debated. Some believe Homo erectus may have developed a proto-language, a basic set of vocal signals or shared meanings, but we have no direct record of it. No inscriptions, no recordings, just space, bones, charcoal. But in the flicker of those early hearths, something seems to shift. Firelight doesn't illuminate the landscape, it illuminates faces. It brings people together, side by side. It allows for gesture, for mimicry, for teaching. And if speech did exist, or was beginning to form, then fire may have been its midwife, a backdrop for repetition, rhythm, and shared attention. Some anthropologists propose that the structure of human conversation itself may have roots in these dark hours around ancient flames, the turn-taking, the cadence, the way silence builds anticipation. These are not random features of language. They are features of people sitting together in light and shadow. And what's fascinating is how fire, unlike stone tools, is not preserved in its full form. It leaves no artifact you can hold. Only its scars remain, burned seeds, blackened bone, layers of ash. Yet those remnants speak volumes, because wherever we find fire, we find change. In diet, in site structure, in social behaviour, and often we find innovation. Some researchers argue that the mastery of fire coincides with bursts of technological creativity. New tool types, new construction, new planning. Could it be that fire changed not only what we could do, but how we could think? By offering safety at night, it freed the mind from constant alertness. By softening food, it changed the gut, which may have allowed energy to shift toward brain development. And by creating a place to gather, it fostered the transmission of ideas that were not tied to stone, but born in light. Long before the first painted walls or carved figurines, fire may have been the original canvas. Its glow cast moving shadows, its rhythm pulsed in flickers and silence. It lit the eyes of those who sat in circles, faces half lit, half lost. And within that glow, a new kind of cognition may have emerged, not just tool use, but tool dreaming. Because fire doesn't only create light. Time to wait, time to observe, time to plan. And planning, as we now know, is one of the foundational pillars of invention. It is not difficult to imagine a stone napper, turning a flint core in their hand near the fire, watching how the light catches along its planes. A failed strike might be re-examined, a fracture considered. Perhaps another hand reaches over, demonstrating an angle. Or perhaps not. Maybe the knowledge remains in silence, passed through the motions of mimicry. Not words. Whatever the case, fire slowed the world just enough for minds to meet. And in that shared stillness, new possibilities could unfold. This is where we begin to see fire not only as a technological aid, but as a cognitive catalyst. Its warmth offered physical safety, but its light offered imaginative space. Space to rehearse actions before performing them, to observe without reacting, to remember. In modern neuroscience, this capacity for deferred action, what researchers sometimes call mental time travel, is a core element of planning. The ability to imagine a sequence of events before they happen, to replay a memory, to visualize a result. And while we cannot see into the thoughts of Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis, we can observe the consequences. More sophisticated tools, more refined hunting strategies, the reuse of campsites and materials, patterns that suggest not only reaction, but intention. At Kisem Cave in Israel, dated to roughly 400,000 years ago, researchers discovered repeated fire use over long periods of time, burned bones, stone tools near hearths, and signs of meat processing. What's notable here is not just the fire itself, but its integration into daily life. Tools and flames coexisted. Hearths were reused, and in that reuse, something subtle and revolutionary occurred. Routine. Fire became part of the rhythm. It marked where to sit, when to eat, how to cook, where to gather, and within that rhythm, innovation could take hold. Because innovation is not born in chaos. It needs moments of pause. It needs feedback. It needs a place to try and fail again and again. And fire, more than any other element, created those moments. It gave early humans the rarest of gifts, a reprieve from urgency, a little time, a little space, a little warmth, and those small margins, almost invisible in the archaeological record, may have lit the path toward everything that came next. Across hundreds of thousands of years, the glow of fire etched itself into the memory of the human lineage, not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a slow, smouldering revolution. Its traces are not found in triumph, but in repetition, in layers of ash that build like sedimentary time, in bones burned not once, but again and again, in the same place, in the blackened floors of shelters where generations sat, warmed by the same simple miracle, sustained flame. And perhaps what fire truly brought was not just a change in tools, but a change in how the world was seen. Because to keep fire alive, you must anticipate its hunger. You must collect fuel before it fades. You must understand that this living heat has needs, and that you, somehow, can meet them. That recognition, simple as it sounds, is profound. It is a moment when cause meets consequence, when the present becomes linked to the future. It's the birth of responsibility, and responsibility, in its quietest form, becomes care. Care for the flame. Care for the others gathered around it. Care for the tools that will be used when the sun returns. And in this care, a new kind of awareness begins to form, not just of what is, but of what might be. This might be the earliest seed of imagination, not fantasy, not myth, not yet, but the spark of possibility, the mind rehearsing outcomes before the hand moves, the moment of pause before the stone is struck, and that pause changes everything. Because when the night becomes more than danger, when it becomes time, the mind begins to stretch. It holds more, it lingers, it reflects, and fire, ephemeral though it is, becomes a vessel for this change. It's no accident that some of the oldest symbolic artifacts we know, carved bones, ochre marks, early figurines, appear in contexts closely associated with fire. These were not made on the hunt. They were not necessities. They were acts of attention. And attention, when shared by firelight, becomes something more than perception. It becomes memory. The firelit face becomes the first mirror. And around the hearth, the first stories, wordless or whispered, may have begun to emerge, not only about what is, but what was, or what might be. A hunt remembered, a shape imagined, a fear named. This is where culture takes root, not in the fire itself, but in the time fire allowed. A time outside of motion, a time to think, a time to be. And so as we move forward into the cold, jagged landscapes of Ice Age Europe and Asia, into shelters where tools grew sharper and minds grew stranger, we carry with us more than a spark. We carry a rhythm, a ritual, a promise that in the heart of the dark, something will burn, and in that flame, something human will stay. The warmth of the flame, the hush of voices around it, the long night stretched open with possibility. These were the spaces where hands began to shape more than stone, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed. A tool no longer had to be just hard or sharp. It could be slender, flexible, even beautiful. The mystery then is this. Why did our ancestors begin shaping bone? Stone is loud, it breaks, it sparks, it leaves scars in the landscape, durable, undeniable. Bone, by contrast, is soft, silent, and ephemeral. Its edges rot. Its forms vanish. The record it leaves behind is partial, delicate, and deeply incomplete. And yet, beginning around 43,000 years ago, we start to find clues. Tiny barbed points carved from reindeer antler. Slender awls shaped from long bones. Smooth, elegant needles with eyes carefully bored at one end. These are the first known artifacts of the Aurignacian period, a culture associated with anatomically modern Homo sapiens who spread into Ice Age Europe as the glaciers loomed to the north. Their stone tools continued the long traditions of flaking and cutting, but their bone tools were something new. Because bone resists fracture differently than flint or obsidian, it bends, it grinds, it curves. Working it requires a different set of movements and, possibly, a different set of intentions. At the site of Abry-Castanet in France, archaeologists discovered pierced animal teeth and carved antler fragments alongside worked blades. These weren't just hunting gear. Some were decorative, some were tiny, and some defied any obvious function. What does it mean when people begin shaping objects not just for use, but perhaps for meaning? The tools of the Aurignacian are haunting because they whisper of minds that were already looking inward. A bone point used to pierce hides might also be polished smooth, decorated with incisions. A needle might be set beside an ochre-stained shell, as if tools and symbols were beginning to blur, and perhaps they were. At Vogelherd, in southwestern Germany, carved ivory figurines of animals, mammoths, lions, horses, have been found in the same layers as bone points and scrapers. Their makers had no metals, no domesticated animals, no writing, and yet they carved these figures with care from mammoth tusk, using only stone blades and bone tools. It's impossible to say exactly what those objects meant, but the pattern is there. The rise of organic tools, accompanied by an explosion in symbolic expression, and it raises a question that will echo throughout this chapter. What if the real story of early technology isn't told in the tools that survived, but in the ones that vanished? Because bone, antler, and ivory rarely last. They dissolve, they disappear. And yet, in the thin layers where they do remain, they suggest a world more complex than stone alone could ever reveal. A world where hands shaped not just the material, but the invisible. Unlike flint, which is struck and split in moments, working bone requires time. It must be softened, scraped, shaped, and often polished. This doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen in haste. It happens in rhythm, patient, quiet, continuous. And in that rhythm, we glimpse something else. Because to make a bone awl or antler point, one must sit. One must hold the material long enough to understand it. The hand learns its grain, the eye follows its curve. The mind learns to see into it, what it could become. And that kind of seeing is deeply human. It's a kind of intimacy with material that speaks not only of skill, but of continuity, of techniques passed down, of knowledge held across generations. The social complexity behind organic tools is harder to see in the archaeological record, but it's there, if we listen. At sites like Grotte du Rennais in France, bone points have been found alongside shell beads, ochre pigments, and child-sized ornaments. These are not the tools of lone foragers. They are the residues of shared life, where children watched adults work, where knowledge was scaffolded, where certain tools were reserved for certain hands. A needle, for example, is not simply a piercing device. It requires thread. Thread implies sinew or plant fibre. It implies cutting hides to fit. It implies fitted clothing. And clothing, made well enough to endure Ice Age winters, implies something even more profound. Care, not just for survival, but for others, for the child wrapped in a stitched fur, for the elder whose fingers can no longer sew, for the injured hunter whose wounds are dressed with cord and hide. These are not things we find in fossilized bones or stratigraphic layers, but they are everywhere in the tools our ancestors left behind. And perhaps that is what bone tools begin to reveal, not just how people survived, but how they belonged. Because tools are not only extensions of the hand, they are also extensions of memory, the shape of a particular needle, the polish on a much-used awl, the slight groove in a long-favoured scraper. Each one becomes part of a person's daily world, not just as an object, but as a companion. They may have been passed down, they may have been buried, they may have carried meanings we can no longer guess, but they existed within relationship, to people, to places, to moments, and that relational web is the hidden heart of prehistoric life. It reminds us that survival wasn't just about killing or carving, it was about mending, stitching, fixing, repeating. It was about creating a world where the human body could endure not only the wind and the cold, but the long passage of time. And bone, for all its fragility, tells that story more clearly than stone ever could. When we speak of the Paleolithic world, we speak mostly in stone. Its permanence gives it authority. It endures. It fills museum cases. It can be measured, classified, mapped. But beneath that durable layer lies a deeper silence, an absence so vast that it warps our understanding. Because most of the tools our ancestors used were not stone at all. They were invisible. They were made of wood, leather, and fibre. They were shaped from antler, sinew, bark, and bone. They were tied, stretched, soaked, dried, and woven, and they are mostly gone. What survives is only what the earth agrees to keep, in dry caves, in frozen soils, in oxygen-free mud. Here and there, at sites like Schöningen in Germany, we catch rare and breathtaking glimpses. Preserved in wet, peaty ground, archaeologists discovered wooden spears over 300, 0 years old, still shaped, still sharp, still bearing the marks of ancient hands. These were not crude branches. They were engineered, balanced, hardened, carefully worked along the grain to fly true. But such finds are exceptions. Most wood vanishes within decades. Most hide decays within days. And plant fibres, cord, netting, woven threads are lost in the span of seasons. This creates what researchers call the preservation bias, an illusion of what mattered, shaped by what survives. Because it's easy to think of early humans as stone tool specialists, but in truth, they may have been fibre cultures. They may have been woodworkers. They may have spent far more time shaping nets and weaving bags than striking flakes from stone. And so we're left with a question that echoes through the archaeological record. Consider this. To trap a hare, you don't need a hand axe. You need cordage, a snare, a trigger. To fish, you don't need a blade. You need line, a hook, or a woven basket weighted with stones. To carry a child, or dried meat, or gathered roots, you need containers, bags, wraps, slings, woven from plant stems or hide. None of these things survive in open-air sites, but they may have been everywhere, and their making would have required deep local knowledge of seasons, of plant types, of fibre strengths, passed from one generation to the next, not as formal teaching, but through repetition, song and touch. This is the invisible toolkit, a world of technology that cradled the living body, that softened the sharpness of stone, that made survival less brutal and more livable. It is not gone, but it is hidden beneath the silence of soil, hidden behind the dominance of stone, hidden in the margins of what we think we know. And yet, when we pause to consider that absence, not as a void, but as a presence we've simply forgotten, the early human world begins to shimmer with complexity. Not harder, not simpler, just softer, and no less brilliant. To call something a tool is already a kind of simplification. It flattens its meaning, reduces it to utility, but in the hands of early humans, tools, especially those carved from bone, may have meant far more than their function. They were not always efficient, they were not always practical, and yet they were made with care. At La Gama, a cave in northern Spain, researchers found an astonishing array of bone objects dating to over 16,000 years ago. Some shaped like points, others carved or pierced. Mixed among them were engraved bones with swirling patterns, zigzags, and cross-hatched forms. Some had no clear use. They were not knives. They were not weapons. They were expressions. Expressions of what? We don't know, but it suggests that by the late Paleolithic, bone was no longer just a medium for survival. It had become a medium for symbolism, for conveying thoughts, emotions, identities, and that shift is worth pausing for, because in choosing bone, not as waste, but as canvas, early humans were engaging in an act of transformation. Bone is what remains when life leaves. It is the remnant of breath and blood and movement. To shape it, carve it, carry it, is to participate in a quiet act of reverence. Perhaps not consciously, perhaps not ritually, but intuitively. The carved bone becomes not only a tool, but a bridge between body and world, between what was hunted and what will come next. Some of these objects, found deep in caves, may have never been seen again after they were placed. They were deposited, left behind, offered to darkness. Why? We don't know, but it tells us something profound, that the mind which shapes a spear point can also shape silence. And silence, too, is a form of language. One carved bone from El Castillo, etched with delicate geometric motifs, may have functioned as a kind of tally. Another from Abri Blanchard holds what appear to be lunar notations, a record of days or cycles. Whether for timekeeping, ritual, or memory, these artifacts suggest that bone tools had begun to participate in something beyond survival. They were participating in the story. Not a story told in words, but in shapes, gestures, marks, and perhaps in the smoothness left by years of touch. A groove polished by the same hand, over and over. A tool worn not from use, but from holding. It's easy to imagine one of these tools passed down, not as a necessity, but as a keepsake, as a memory of a person, or a place, or a moment. A child given a parent's carved awl, a partner holding a hunter's worn point. These are not things we can prove, but the objects hint. They suggest an emotional texture to the past, a tenderness, a remembering, and if the Ice Age taught anything, it was that to survive, you needed more than weapons. You needed meaning. In the end, what we hold in our museums are the fragments that refuse to leave. Stone, ivory, a few bits of scorched antler, but the rest, woven grass, stitched leather, knotted cordage, pigment brushed onto skin, has returned to the earth, atom by atom, without a trace. And that is not a failure of preservation. It is a truth of time, because the most vital parts of early human life may not have been meant to last. The whisper of a mother tying sinew thread, the crack of an antler awl-piercing hide, the soft brushing of ochre into hair before a hunt. These moments are not recoverable. They were never meant to be. They lived, and then they were gone, but that doesn't mean they were less important than the flint blade or the carved figurine. In fact, they may have been more important, because they tethered the body to the moment. They stitched the living to the land and to each other. That is the paradox of the prehistoric record. We remember what was least like us, stone, but we forget what was closest, fibre, flesh, and bone. Still, the clues remain, in the shape of a needle, in the polish on a tiny point, in the patterns carved into an old reindeer scapula that someone, tens of thousands of years ago, decided was worth keeping, or hiding, or letting go. These were not just tools, they were gestures. They were traces of minds that saw not only what was, but what could be. And that vision, the shaping of possibility, is what defines us. It was not the sharpness of stone that made us human. It was the willingness to soften it, to wrap it in cord, to hide it in cloth, to hold it in the palm while telling a story, long after the fire had gone out. So, as we move forward, deeper into the late Ice Age, into a time of reindeer herds and bone flutes, cave paintings and cold winds, we carry this awareness, that for every tool we find, a dozen were lost, that for every bone carved, a voice once spoke, and that beneath the hard, glittering surface of prehistory was always something warm, something flexible, something alive. The hand, the thread, the breath, these things do not fossilize, but they mattered, and somewhere, in a cave floor now collapsed, in a campsite long washed away by rain, a child once dropped a carved bone figure into the dust, and ran, laughing, into the snow. It's gone now, but it happened, and that is the story bone tells, not loudly, like flint, but in murmurs, not in permanence, but in presence. Somewhere in the snow-melt silence, the hand closed again, not on bone, but on stone made finer, a thinner edge, a cleaner line, and something had changed. The haunting question, then, is what happens when a tool no longer feels like something held, but something felt, as if it extends the body itself. Roughly 35,000 years ago, across parts of Eurasia, the archaeological record begins to show signs of a quiet, enduring revolution. The emergence of true blade technology. This was not simply another variant of chipped rock, it was an evolution in philosophy, a reimagining of what a tool could be. Instead of knocking off short the irregular flakes from a stone core, the technique used for hundreds of thousands of years in the Acheulean and Mousterian traditions, our ancestors began to prepare cores specifically to produce long, parallel-sided blades. These blades were narrower, thinner, and far more efficient. A single prepared core could now yield several sharp blades, maximizing the utility of a single chunk of flint or obsidian. But why this shift? Why now? The answer may lie in the growing complexity of Ice Age life, both its demands and its rhythms. In regions like Upper Paleolithic France, Germany, and Siberia, we see not only more people, but more movement, more specialization, more pressure to adapt tools not just to the body's needs, but to the tasks of a changing world. Blades could be resharpened many times. They could be inserted into handles. They could be shaped into projectile points, carving knives, burins for engraving, or even delicate scrapers for preparing hides. They were more than stone. They were potential. And potential is power. The technical name for this industry is the aurignation, after the site of Aurignac in southern France, where some of its first examples were found. Spanning from roughly 43,000 to 26,000 years ago, it marked a period of extraordinary innovation. Blade-based tools, yes, but also bone and ivory carving, art, and perhaps the first musical instruments. But at its core, quite literally, was a new relationship between mind and material. Because to make a blade, the napper had to imagine not just the strike, but the shape beneath, the hidden geometry of the core, the possible futures nested inside the rock. This required mental mapping, precision, and control, and with each successful removal of a blade, the stone responded, almost like muscle memory. One French archaeologist once described it as flint choreography, a sequence of gestures passed through time, from hand to hand, generation to generation. And so we see the shift from tools as objects to tools as extensions, not just something you hold, but something you anticipate, something that remembers how you move. And the implications of that shift ripple forward through spears, scrapers, awls, and eventually weapons that could be thrown with force beyond the body's own. The blade had arrived, and it would change everything. Sharpness alone is not enough. A blade, however fine, must meet the world through a structure, a handle, a shaft, a socket. Without this, it remains a fragment. With it, it becomes whole. And so emerged one of the quiet masterstrokes of Paleolithic innovation. Hafting. To haft a blade is to join it with something else, typically wood, bone, or antler, to create a compound tool. This may sound simple, but in reality, it was a leap in complexity. It required more than just friction. It required adhesion. It required chemistry, and that chemistry came from the earth itself. Across archaeological sites in Europe and parts of Africa, traces of early glues have been found. Sticky black substances made from birch bark pitch, pine resin, or even ochre-mixed compounds. Some were simple tars, created by slow-burning bark in low-oxygen environments. Others were more elaborate, incorporating fillers, heating cycles, and binding agents like beeswax. This was not trial and error, it was recipe. And every recipe implies memory. One site in Germany, Königssee, yielded lumps of birch pitch dated to over 80 years ago, some bearing fingerprints. These were not the marks of fire starting or casual contact. They were the impressions of individuals who understood the pitch's purpose, who tested its tack, who waited and pressed and bound. With hafting, the tool became more than itself. A flint blade tied with sinew to a wooden shaft became a spear. An obsidian flake glued into a grooved antler became a knife, and a row of tiny stone microliths inset along a wooden club or javelin became a deadly cutting edge, capable of inflicting wounds far worse than a single blow. This was modularity, a mindset of assemblage. And assemblage is philosophy, a recognition that the parts are not the whole, but together they achieve something new. In this way, hafting mirrors the evolution of thought itself. Because now, when a hunter lifted a spear, they were not just holding wood or stone, they were holding the results of collaboration between gatherer and napper, between fire tender and pitchmaker, between memory and invention. This collaboration extended beyond the tool's creation. It shaped its use. A spear could now be thrown from a distance. This changed hunting strategy. A knife could now be gripped with more force and precision. This changed butchery. A scraper, hafted at a specific angle, could be used for longer periods with less strain. This changed labour. And each change in physical interaction echoed into the social structure. Tools that could be repaired, shared, traded. Tools that had parts. Tools that had identity. Because when a blade is hafted, it stops being anonymous. It becomes assembled by someone. It carries intention, style, even preference. And that, in time, begins to resemble ownership. To tie a blade to a shaft is to bind more than materials. It binds memory to motion, person to purpose, thought to thing, because as tools became more specialized, thinner, sharper, shaped with greater nuance, they also began to reflect their makers in a deeper, more personal way. And that shift is not just technological, it is psychological. In the earliest periods of stone tool use, tools were likely communal. They were shaped quickly and discarded without sentiment. But in the blade and haft world of the Upper Paleolithic, something begins to change. We see signs of craftsmanship, not just function, but care, not just sharpness, but style. Microscopic analyses of certain blades reveal polish patterns that suggest routine maintenance. Some show careful reworking, even after damage, resharpened edges, reshaped tips, adjusted angles. This tells us that the user valued the tool, that they had spent time with it, that they wanted it to last. At some point, perhaps for the first time in history, a human looked at a tool and saw not just a thing, but their thing. And from that, a strange and beautiful reciprocity may have emerged. You shape the tool, and the tool shapes you. You walk differently with a spear in hand. You dress differently when your knife slices more cleanly. You begin to think ahead, not just to tomorrow, but to what your tools could be if shaped better, balanced differently, carried more easily. In this way, identity and technology begin to entwine. There is evidence that certain groups preferred certain hafting styles, angled bindings, resin types, blade lengths, passed down through habit, culture, perhaps even aesthetic taste. One group favors straight-backed points, another favors leaf-shaped. Why? Maybe no reason at all, or maybe pride. Because once a tool becomes expressive, it becomes a mirror, and in mirrors, we begin to see ourselves. This may explain the rise of decorated tools during this era, not just functional marks but engravings, dots, lines, chevrons. Sometimes the meaning is clear: ownership, tallying, spiritual symbols. Other times, they are simply there because they are beautiful. What does that say? That the tool was not just used, it was seen, and being seen is the beginning of narrative. Some bone handles were carved with animals. Some flint blades bear edge fluting that serves no cutting purpose. Some tools, once broken, were kept, buried in caves, placed beside bodies, or hung on cords. This is not useful. This is a relationship. It suggests a shift from the tool as an object to the tool as a companion, still silent, still inanimate, but touched daily, named perhaps, trusted. And in trusting it, the user comes to trust themselves, their hand, their aim, their place in the world. The blade no longer lives outside the body. It begins to live with it. A tool that reflects its maker is not born in isolation. It is learned, and once learned, it can be taught. This may be one of the most significant consequences of blade technology, not the sharpness, but the transmission. Because once tools became more complex, they also became harder to replicate without guidance. Trial and error could still play a role, yes, but increasingly, success required demonstration, observation, repetition. In other words, apprenticeship. And apprenticeship requires a new kind of memory, not just episodic but procedural. How to heat the pitch, how to find the right stone, where to strike the core, how tightly to wrap the sinew without snapping it. These are subtle skills. They live in the body as much as in the mind, and in that body-to-body teaching, a kind of intimacy arises. A child watching their parent press a flint blade into resin, a mentor showing the arc of the swing, the feel of balance. These are not just technical gestures. They are moments of shared time, and shared time becomes tradition. Tradition becomes culture. By the late Upper Paleolithic, some tool types appear to have remained stable across generations and landscapes, with regional styles blossoming into full technological dialects. In the Gravettian period, for instance, backed bladelets, small, sharp inserts used in projectile weapons, spread widely but were modified locally in subtle, beautiful ways. Why? Because tools were no longer just about survival. They were about belonging. A particular style of spear point marked not just a prey, but a people. And in these variations, archaeologists can trace the invisible lines of social cohesion, how groups migrated, how they interacted, how ideas flowed through kinship, trade, or imitation. This is where the blade becomes something more than a cutting edge. It becomes a vessel for memory, for motion, for meaning. Some scholars argue that blade-based traditions laid the cognitive groundwork for symbolic thought, abstract connections, shared conventions, long-term planning. After all, to make a composite tool requires a vision of the unseen, a future act, a future use, a future self. This, too, is remarkable, because it means the blade was not just a reflection of the hand that made it. It was a reflection of the mind behind that hand, a mind capable of imagining a tomorrow and shaping today to meet it. Even now, to hold a flint blade from 30,000 years ago is to feel that echo, the rhythm of strikes, the angle of grip, the balance between weight and purpose. It is not dead. It is paused, waiting for the hand that once held it, or one that still remembers how. And through that memory, the blade is reborn, not just as tool, but as gesture. Somewhere in the silence of a Paleolithic morning, a flint blade was lifted, and it did not feel like stone. It felt like I was ready, because by now, the tool was no longer separate. It had been carried, reshaped, warmed by the hand. It had memories of hides stretched, meat sliced, fires kindled, threats deflected. Its edge was not just sharp, it was familiar, and in that familiarity lies the final transformation. The blade had become a body. This is not a metaphor, it is a cognitive event. In neuroscience, the phenomenon is called tool embodiment, the brain's quiet decision to include an external object within its sense of the self. It happens today when a pianist forgets their hands while playing, or when a skilled carpenter stops noticing the handle of their chisel, but it happened then, too, in the mind of a reindeer hunter drawing their spear, in the hand of a woman slicing fibers for thread, in the body of a child learning how to grip, not by instinct, but by watching someone else hold what they too would hold. Through the blade, they extended their reach, but they also extended their identity. And this is one of the quietest revolutions in prehistory. Because the moment a tool becomes part of you, the loss of that tool becomes personal. If it breaks, you feel it. If it is taken, you grieve. If it is gifted, you remember. Ownership, then, is not just economic, it is emotional. We see this in the rare tools placed in burials, in the blades hidden in caves, in the broken handles left near hearths. These were not simply discarded. They were laid down, with intention, and sometimes ceremony. They had stories, even if we will never hear them, because this was the age when tools became not just used, but lived with. They slept by the fire. They hung at the hip. They travelled far, across glaciers, through valleys, across steppes swept clean by wind. And in every step, the blade was a companion, not one that speaks, but one that listens, one that remembers the way your hand curves, the angle of your strike, the softness of sinew, the tension of the knot. This is the deepest layer of the archaeological record, not what we find, but what was felt, what left no trace but touch. So, as this chapter closes, we carry that awareness forward, that a tool, in time, becomes more than function. It becomes familiar. It becomes form. It becomes you. And as the Ice Age deepens and the world grows colder still, the blade will travel with us, into the dark, into the unknown, into the art and the breath, and the buried memory of what it meant to shape the world, and to let the world shape you back. And as the edge travelled with them, sharp as memory, silent as bone, it became part of a larger rhythm. Not just the rhythm of tools and hands, but of many bodies, moving as one, because the Ice Age did not belong to the solitary. It belonged to the synchronized. And the quiet but pressing question is this: how did our ancestors learn to hunt together with such precision before they had maps, calendars, or clocks? It is a question of orchestration. We often imagine ancient hunts as chaotic charges, wild and breathless. But the archaeological evidence paints a different picture, one that is not frantic, but fluid. A choreography across frozen plains, coordinated through gesture, sound, and shared understanding. This was the Mammoth Steppe, an enormous and treeless biome that stretched from the west of France to the east of Siberia. Wind-scoured, grass-rich, and bitterly cold, it was home to some of the largest and most dangerous animals ever faced by humans. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, wild horses, and giant bison. And yet, they were hunted, not one by one in desperate ambushes, but in groups, sometimes dozens of individuals, working in sync to control the movement of animals that weighed as much as a truck. The key to that orchestration? It may have been a deceptively simple object, the atlatl. Spear throwers, known today by their Nahuatl-derived name, atlatl, were an extraordinary innovation in mechanical thinking. Instead of throwing a spear by arm alone, early humans crafted a tool, often from antler or wood, with a small hook or socket at the end. Into this they set a lightweight dart, longer and more flexible than a spear. The thrower would then flick the arm forward, and the atlatl would act as a lever, multiplying force, increasing range, and giving the dart astonishing speed and power. Some estimates suggest these darts could fly over 100 kilometers per hour, but this was not just about killing from a distance. It was about synchronizing distance. With an atlatl, the hunter no longer had to rush into stabbing range. They could stand in formation. They could create arcs of fire. They could push a mammoth toward a cliff edge, or a bison toward a waiting line of dart throwers, each one positioned like a note in a musical score, timing their throws not by command, but by rhythm. And perhaps most remarkably, the atlatl did not require everyone to be the same. A smaller hunter, or one less strong, could still throw a deadly dart. This opened the field, literally and socially, to more participants. Children might train in targeting long before they could run with the others. Elders might advise on wind and placement. Strategy grew where brute force once ruled, but what the atlatl truly introduced was something rarer still. Anticipation. You had to lead your target, predict its motion, time your release to the future, not the present. To hunt with an atlatl was to step into a kind of shared time, a future held between many hands. And in that act, silent, calculated, practiced, we hear the first notes of a symphony. A symphony made not of instruments, but of intent. Intent, when multiplied, becomes structure. And nowhere is that structure more hauntingly preserved than in the open plains of what is now the Czech Republic. At a site known as Dolní Věstonice, nestled along the banks of a glacial river, this Upper Paleolithic settlement has yielded one of the richest records of Ice Age life ever found. Thousands of stone tools, ornaments of ivory and shell, hearths blackened by repeated use, even the partial remains of woven textiles, delicate threads pressed into the floor of a long-collapsed shelter. But among these fragments of daily life lies something else, evidence of strategy. Because near the site, archaeologists uncovered the remains of large animal traps, deep pits, and arranged stones, and the clustered bones of hunted prey. Not scattered or chaotic, but gathered deliberately, sorted, processed. This was not a kill site born of chance. It was prepared. The people who lived at Dolní Věstonice did not simply respond to opportunity. They studied the terrain, predicted the movement of herds, worked together to steer animals into ambushes, or perhaps even penned them in with temporary fences of brush and bone. This is not speculation. It is a pattern, and patterns, when repeated over time, suggest something more than instinct. They suggest memory. Hunting large prey in groups requires more than good aim. It demands shared attention, agreement without words, the ability to hold a plan in your head while also adapting to the living, breathing unpredictability of animals in motion. Imagine the scene. A herd of reindeer on the horizon. The wind shifts. Voices drop to whispers. Eyes scan the flanks. A signal, perhaps a lifted arm, perhaps a bird call, ripples down the line of waiting hunters. And then, movement, but not chaos. A flank of runners begins to press the animals from one side. Another group holds a line, invisible behind a ridge. Darts fly. Some miss. Some strike. The herd veers, just as intended, toward a narrow pass where others wait in silence. This is not a moment. This is a system. And what makes such systems possible is not just physical tools, but mental maps of terrain, of animal behavior, of each other. To coordinate like this is to hold not just your own role, but the roles of others in mind. To act in concert, even if you're spread across hundreds of meters. The word strategy may feel modern, but its roots are ancient. At Dolní Věstonice, it took shape in bone and ice, and it was passed on, through gesture, through modelling, through story. Not all hunters would be leaders, but someone remembered the trails. Someone knew how the herd moved when snow crusted over. Someone understood the way a mammoth would turn its flank towards sound, and when it would not. These are not just hunting techniques. They are thought forms. The hunt becomes a kind of shared cognition, distributed across minds, across voices, across generations. And in that shared mind, a quiet brilliance begins to form, a kind of intelligence not of individuals, but of many. To coordinate without shouting is to trust in other ways of speaking. And this, perhaps, is where the hunt becomes music. Because in the frozen silence of the mammoth steppe, language alone was not enough. Words could carry yes, but so could wind and snow and the wary ears of prey. What was needed was something subtler, something that could signal without startling, direct without disrupting. Sound, then, became a tool, but not the kind that fossilizes. These were sounds made of reed and bone, of breath and rhythm, of skin stretched over hollow forms. Simple instruments, flutes, whistles, clappers, have been found in sites from France to Germany, many dated to over 30 years ago. Some are playable even now. Their notes are high, bird-like, familiar. Why? Perhaps they mimicked the animals themselves. A sudden trill, like a ptarmigan's call. A click, like a deer's hoof on stone. These sounds did not belong to the humans who made them. They borrowed from the environment to mask their presence, to communicate without standing apart. This was camouflage of the ears, but it did not end there. There are carvings, fragments of antler and ivory that appear to be masks, or animal heads worn as hats, snouts of foxes, eyes of mammoths. They may have been ornamental, they may have been sacred, but they may also have been used in the hunt, as disguise. Imagine again the open plain, a small group of hunters moving low through tall grass. They wear cloaks made of hide. Their heads are crowned with animal bones. Their movements are slow, deliberate, practiced not to be human. They are not hiding, they are blending. This too is a kind of choreography, a psychological theatre played for prey, to get closer, without triggering the instincts of panic. Ethnographic accounts from Arctic cultures suggest that such tactics, using decoys, imitating animal behavior, moving in synchronized silence, persisted into the modern era. These were not crude tricks. They were art forms, refined through generations of trial and reflection. Even silence was crafted. A hand signal passed between two hunters, a flick of the wrist, a pause, the timing of a step between gusts of wind, listening not just for the animal, but for the others nearby, trusting that they too were listening. In this, the hunt becomes more than group activity. It becomes an ensemble. No conductor, only memory, only rhythm, only the shared language of intention. It is tempting to think of tools as things made of stone and bone, but some were made of air, of mimicry, of movement. They're not preserved in sediment or cave walls. They are preserved in gesture, in how people move together. And in that movement, we see the dawning of something rare, not just survival, but coordination without command, not order imposed by dominance, but alignment born of listening. And in this alignment, the symphony grows deeper, more layered, more human and more connected. Because to hunt like this, together, in silence, in pattern, is not only an act of survival, it is an act of belonging. Coordination leaves traces beyond the body. After the hunt, when the adrenaline has faded and the meat is shared, something else remains. Memory of the shared moment. The glance that meant move. The call that meant wait. The silent gratitude when someone's dart struck true, because it fed everyone. This is not modern nostalgia. It is a deep function. To survive in Ice Age ecosystems, human groups had to be more than bands of individuals. They had to think together, move together, celebrate and grieve together. And so, the hunt was not just a way to eat, it was a way to become a group. Even today, psychologists speak of shared intentionality, the ability to form a common goal and act on it with others. It's considered a uniquely human trait. Most species compete, some cooperate, but humans plan together, even across time. And where does that trait begin? Perhaps here, in the hunt that required preparation, in the gesture that meant now, in the fire that followed, where stories were told, not just of success, but of sequence. Who went where? What worked? What will be remembered? Because the more dangerous the hunt, the more valuable the memory. This is how choreography becomes culture, when patterns are not only repeated but reflected on. When someone begins to say, "Do you remember last winter?" When the bison turned at the ravine, and others nod, not just because they remember the meat, but because they remember the timing, the beauty of that moment when every step, every throw, every voice aligned. That memory is more than nostalgia. It's data, passed down, refined, embedded in song or gesture or myth. And this may be one of the earliest roots of something even deeper: ritual. At sites like Dolní Věstonice and others across the Mammoth Steppe, we find traces of ceremonial behaviour tied to the hunt: careful burials, arranged bones, symbolic carvings. Some are shaped like animals. Some are female figurines, perhaps linked to fertility or rebirth. But all suggest something more than practical intent. They suggest meaning, and meaning, when shared, becomes glue. It binds generations who never met. It links action with memory, tool with tale, gesture with identity. In this sense, the hunter's symphony was never just about the hunt. It was about learning to move as one, to breathe in time with others, to know without speaking. Because when the cold wind swept across the plains, when the herds were spotted, when the moment came to rise together and act, there was no time for debate. Only motion, only trust. And in that trust, something sacred was born. Not a religion, not yet, but something close. A rhythm of many bodies, a memory made of motion, and a future that would remember. A future that would remember, even if it forgot the names. Because the names are gone, there are no records of who led the lines, who crafted the darts, who first noticed the way wind curled around a hill and used it to guide a herd. But what remains is the pattern. In bones, in paths, in the echo of a shared design. What was once choreography in motion became choreography in memory, and that memory still shapes us. Not as individuals, but as a species attuned to the movements of others. Even now, in crowds or teams or silent glances between friends, we feel it. That strange, almost invisible thread of unspoken timing. We are, still, creatures of the hunt, but not the hunt of blood alone, the hunt for alignment, of listening and leading in the same breath, of stepping forward just when another pauses. It is built into how we walk in groups, how we dance, how we play music, how we raise children, how we build cities. It began with tools, yes. The atlatl, the whistle, the trap, the mask. These were not mere objects, but extensions of thought, of timing, of coordination. But the greatest tool that emerged was not carved from wood or flint or antler. It was carved from attention, shared attention, the ability to hold the minds of others on your own. To anticipate, to trust, to move in time with something larger than yourself. And over generations, that ability deepened. It became culture, and culture became the true instrument. Somewhere on the Mammoth Steppe, long after the hunt had ended, a child watched the older ones reenact the movements of the chase. A mock throw, a sidestep, a sudden shout that meant now. They laughed, they mimicked, and they remembered. Not because they were told, but because it felt right. It felt known. This is how memory moves through bodies, how choreography becomes heritage. And in this silent inheritance, we see that the hunt was never only about food. It was about timing, about patterns, about placing yourself in space and time with others in ways that matter. Even today, in the stillness of a darkened cave, we find lines of ochre that curve like a mammoth's back, or footprints preserved in ancient mud that move in a quiet line, one adult, one child, side by side. They are not frozen in panic. They are walking together, and the rhythm of their steps carries forward, like a distant drumbeat, into the present, because the hunter's symphony never ended. It only changed form. And so tonight, as you listen, as your breath slows, perhaps you can feel it, faintly, that rhythm, that ancient trust, the silent signal that says, it's time, let's move, together. Even in silence, there was movement, long after the thrum of footfalls had faded across the Mammoth Steppe. The memory of the path remained, etched not into stone, but into the mind. Because what the hand carved into tools, the mind carved into space. And sometimes, when the snow fell thick and the world turned white, memory itself became the most important tool of all. But how does one navigate a landscape where nothing stands still and everything looks the same? That is the quiet question that now emerges from the frozen air. When ice obscured the land and snow erased all signs, how did our ancestors find their way, not just across vast distances, but through time and meaning itself? Across Ice Age Europe and Central Asia, evidence suggests that movement wasn't random. It followed cycles, routes, and patterns too consistent to be chance. Bands of hunter-gatherers returned season after season to familiar hunting grounds, river crossings, and cave shelters. Mammoth bones and reindeer antlers left in organized clusters trace not chaos but choreography, a choreography of return. One example lies at Verberie in northern France, where archaeologists uncovered repeated layers of flint-napping debris, hearth ash, and butchered animal bones. Not a one-time stop, but a waypoint, visited over generations, perhaps centuries. Another site, Pavlov in the Czech Republic, shows signs of semi-permanent dwellings, mammoth bone walls, fired clay figurines, arranged hearths. To us, these might look like static places, but for them, these were stations along a larger map, a circuit of memory. And memory, in this context, was not only spatial, it was seasonal. Knowing when to move was as vital as knowing where. Some animals migrated in waves, caribou herds, wild horses, mammoths. To intercept them, you had to anticipate. You had to remember the feel of the wind in a certain month, the sound the ice made when it thinned beneath your feet, the exact week the riverbanks would bloom with edible shoots. These were not written records. These were embodied memories, passed through gesture, repetition, and ritual, and slowly, over generations, those invisible maps began to take form in material things. A notch on a bone, a charcoal mark on a cave wall, a carved pattern on a piece of ivory. To us, they may seem abstract, but to those who lived by the rhythm of the land, these were mnemonics. Anchors. Tools, not of hunting, but of remembering. In this way, the mind became its own landscape, mapped not by roads, but by associations. The smell of mammoth fat mixed with spruce smoke, the angle of sunlight in a narrow valley, the shape of stars when a certain bird called at dusk. These were the cues that guided them, long after trails had vanished, and perhaps long before the first word had ever been spoken, because in the white silence of the glacial world, knowledge didn't shout, it whispered. Quietly, persistently, and those who listened survived. Survival, then, was not only a question of direction, it was a question of meaning, and nowhere is this meaning more quietly inscribed than in the flickering chambers of ancient caves, where charcoal and ochre danced across limestone walls, and silence spoke in symbols. What was left behind was not just art, it was orientation, a way to remember where and when you are. To walk into a place like Chauvet or Lascaux is to step into a world where memory is spatial, deer running in profile, bison layered upon bison, dot clusters, spiral lines, a handprint, left perhaps by a young girl over 20 years ago. We do not know what she meant, but we know she meant. These markings were not idle. They were made in the depths of caves, beyond the reach of sunlight, requiring firelight, intention, and return. Some figures were drawn over others, suggesting layers of memory, not just images. A palimpsest of presence. Recent studies propose that some cave paintings may have served as cognitive maps, mnemonic devices to remember where animals moved, when they bred, where dangers lay. The animals depicted are not random. They cluster in seasonal groupings. Horses and aurochs, reindeer and salmon, each one appearing at a certain time of year. A visual calendar. But more than this, the cave walls themselves become memory palaces, a concept known today from Greek orators and memory athletes. The method of loci associates knowledge with spatial location. Walk a known path, and at each turn, place an idea. To remember, you walk it again, in your mind. Was this already happening in the Paleolithic? It may have been. Imagine, a cave system known since childhood. At this bend, you see the reindeer. You remember the winter stories. At that alcove, the bear, the sacred warning of spring's return. At the final chamber, a spiral, a sign of something deeper. Something not just about animals, but about death, birth, time, and still it remains tactile, fingers pressed into soft clay, red ochre blown over palms, lines incised with flint. These were not passive records. They were acts of marking, of remarking, of remembering. In this way, the cave becomes both shelter and scripture, not in words, but in space, pigment, and rhythm. Some caves show clear paths, where torch, soot, and footprints suggest guided movement, as if visitors were being led, not just through geology, but through narrative. And so, we must ask, were these caves sacred? Were they educational? Were they mnemonic tools for a people who moved constantly, but needed to carry memory across distance and time? Perhaps the answer is yes to all, because in a world where the land itself changes, where ice advances, rivers shift, and herds disappear overnight, what you carry in your mind may be more vital than any tool in your hand. And so memory becomes a kind of migration too, not across valleys, but across generations. Across generations, memory needed to move, but caves, for all their resonance, stayed still. They anchored meaning to a place, but humans were rarely still. They wandered, they returned. They fled, adapted, reappeared. In the uncertain rhythm of glacial time, permanence was dangerous, portability was survival. So the map began to shrink, from cave wall to carved object, from gesture to token, and from landscape to hand. Archaeologists speak of portable art, a term that belies its quiet weight. These were not trinkets. They were carriers of memory, meaning, and perhaps even emotion. Small figurines of animals, etched bones with repeating marks, pendants, abstract shapes, pieces of ivory or antler with notches like counting tools. They could be held, hidden, passed on. Some, like the Venus figurines, have become icons in our understanding of Ice Age culture. Found from France to Siberia, these carved forms, exaggerated, stylized, and unmistakably human, appear again and again across time and space. Were they fertility symbols, identity markers, ancestor tokens? Perhaps all of these, or none. What matters is that they were carried through blizzards, through births and burials, through time, and with them other items, less famous perhaps, but no less powerful. A decorated baton, a marked plaque, a carved reindeer on a shard of antler. Some of these have patterns that resemble lunar cycles or seasonal rhythms. Others suggest tally marks. Still others, impossible to decipher, whisper only that someone cared enough to record, because marking is not just for others, it's also for oneself, a kind of self-addressed future, a reminder, a tether, a memory wrapped in bone. Portable memory objects, then, may have been among our earliest tools of abstraction. Unlike spears or scrapers, they did not cut or kill. They anchored thought. They made the invisible visible, and in doing so, they extended the human mind beyond the moment, and they were personal. Imagine a small ivory piece, carved and smoothed by a single individual. It is kept close, worn against the skin, handed from parent to child. Not because of its utility, but because of its meaning. This is not technology in the narrow sense. It is cognitive architecture, a structure for remembering, for belonging, for becoming. And in a world that changed so often, where glaciers cracked and forests vanished, this kind of memory wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. These objects didn't just tell stories. They preserved orientation. Emotional, social, spiritual, and perhaps most critically, ancestral. Because to carry a symbol is to say, I was here. To hand it to another is to say, now you are. And to bury it, perhaps, is to whisper, remember me. In this way, the Ice Age traveller carried more than tools. They carried time itself, wrapped in carvings, hung from cords, passed between hands. And so, even in the shadowed silence of the Ice Age, where wind howled and white stretched to the horizon, meaning moved, quietly, steadily, as a bone, as a memory, as inheritance. Inheritance, after all, is not only blood, it is a pattern, it is repetition, and sometimes it is a shape, scratched gently into the edge of an antler, or looped into the spiral of a carving that no longer has a name. These were tools made not to slice meat or bore holes in hide, but to keep a kind of continuity alive, a thought that could travel, even if the person who first held it could not. Some of these items bear signs of wear. Holes where cords once passed, polish from handling, edges rubbed smooth by fingers over decades. Others show careful arrangement, buried with the dead, laid beside infants, wrapped in fur and ochre, as if to say, take this with you. Wherever you are going, this belongs to you. And that belonging may not have been individual. It may have been collective. Because while some objects feel personal, tokens of love, grief, or identity, others seem to point outward, towards something larger, a group, a clan, a belief system, a shared idea of place. The markings themselves are tantalizing: dots, chevrons, crosshatches, sometimes linear, sometimes circular, sometimes cascading like water or flames. Some resemble constellations, others river paths, and others still, perhaps, the pulse of ritual itself. This is where tools and ceremonies begin to blur. What begins as a carved line becomes a gesture. What begins as a gesture becomes a rite, and what begins as a rite becomes a shared rhythm, a memory not just held by one, but distributed across many. This is the quiet architecture of ritual: repetition, space, attention. And in the Ice Age, ritual may have been the only thing stable enough to withstand time. In a world of vanishing tracks and collapsing glaciers, ritual gave structure, a moment of return, a shared breath, a mark made not for utility, but for meaning. Imagine a winter gathering in a sheltered valley, flames licking mammoth bones, children watching elders scratch a symbol into stone as it had been scratched for generations, a bone passed hand to hand, a story half spoken, half danced, and beneath it all, the object, the carving, remains constant, a physical echo of memory. In this way, symbolic tools became more than items. They became anchors, to mark the season, to honor the hunt, to remember the lost. Some were left behind deliberately, placed high in cave niches, buried under stones, hidden in cracks where no eye would easily see, not because they were forgotten, but because they were meant to be found again. Or perhaps, not by people at all, perhaps the placement was for something else, for spirits, for ancestors, for the land itself, because meaning, in this deep-time world, wasn't always meant to be interpreted. Sometimes it was meant simply to exist, to be, and by being, to hold open a space between then and now, between here and there, between the living and the remembered, between what is made and what is meant. What is meant, after all, may not always be known, but it can still be felt, in the carved spiral of a pendant, in the way a row of notches lines up with the season, in the quiet arrangement of stones around an ancient hearth, still holding the shape of someone's absence. For our Ice Age ancestors, to survive was to orient. But to orient wasn't merely to find direction. It was to place the self within a web of memory, belonging, and meaning, a map not just of geography, but of time, kinship, and spirit. And so, the mind reached beyond the moment, not just to know where the herds would move, not just to remember where the cave entrance was, or how many days of snow remained, but to hold on to the invisible, rituals, seasons, names, and in doing so, to become something more than reactive, to become remembering. This shift was quiet, but profound. Somewhere between the flake and the fire, between the antler point and the mammoth carving, the human mind learned to externalize itself. Not just in tools for hands, but in tools for thought. Bone plaques, ochre marks, pendants, rhythms, each one whispered, "This matters." And by whispering it again and again, generation after generation, it did matter. In the grand silence of glacial Europe, these small signs became anchors. They held thought in place. They gave the intangible, memory, emotion, orientation, a shape, a weight, a place to return to. And in this way, memory became a form of landscape itself. To walk a trail was to retrace a lineage. To touch a carving was to touch an ancestor. To draw a symbol was to extend the past into the present. None of this required writing. None of this required language as we know it. Just attention. Just presence. Just the will to remember. And that will, more than any tool, may have been the deepest innovation of all. Because when the glaciers finally began to pull back, and the lands changed once more, when old paths disappeared and new rivers carved through ancient plains, it was memory that carried humanity forward, not fixed in place, but always moving, always adapting, always returning. And so the trail continues, not just on the land, but in us, in the shapes we carve, in the patterns we repeat, in the stories we keep telling, even when their meaning flickers just beyond reach. Next, we will follow that flicker deeper, into the weaving of fibers, the crafting of traps, the quiet tools of gathering and tending, tools that rarely survive, yet shaped entire lifeways. Because not all survival was shaped by the hunt. Some of it was shaped by waiting, by weaving, by knowing when not to move. In the next chapter, the ice does not retreat yet, but something else begins to take root. Patience, design, the stillness of a snare beneath the snow. There are traces, still, of what they built. Circles of mammoth bones, rings of tusks, sunk upright in frozen soil. A place between the wind and the firelight. Not just shelter, but intention. Evidence of something more than mere survival. This is where the story moves inside. What does it mean to shape a space? To choose, not just where to sleep, but how to live together inside the cold. This is the quiet mystery that echoes beneath the bones. By the time our Ice Age ancestors began shaping the great bone huts of Ukraine, they had already crossed hundreds of frozen frontiers. Glacial winds, dry grasslands, and mammoth herds had carved a new rhythm into human life, one of movement, endurance, and memory. But movement required pause, rest, shelter. Not all caves could be counted on, and in the flat open tundras there were few to be found. So they built it. The mammoth bone dwellings of Mezirik and the plains near the Dnieper River are some of the oldest known examples of constructed winter homes. Tens of thousands of years old, they show deliberate placement of bones, skulls, ribs, tusks, arranged in circular foundations, reinforced with soil and perhaps hides or turf. Some still contain fire pits, stone tools, and even jewellery. The walls curve inward like nests, enclosing warmth against the vast breadth of the steppe. How do we know they were homes, and not something else? The answer lies in patterns. Archaeologists look for hearths, clusters of tools, and animal bones that suggest repeated habitation. Charcoal stains, post holes, and grinding stones imply food, family, routine, and while mammoth bone huts are the most dramatic examples, they are not alone. Further north, and deep into Siberia, circular impressions of tent rings hint at shelters made from hides stretched over frames. Some even show evidence of insulation, double walls packed with moss or snow. To build in this way, carefully, intentionally, suggests planning. It suggests knowledge passed on through generations, and perhaps even roles within a group. Who gathered bones? Who dug the post holes? Who knew how to shape the entrance to catch the morning sun? But shelter is not just walls, it is a layout. And here, the archaeological record begins to whisper about something quieter: spatial awareness. In many Paleolithic dwellings, whether natural caves or constructed huts, we find zones. Sleeping areas near the walls, hearths in the centre, or slightly offset. Tool-making debris in predictable clusters. Waste discarded outside, in consistent directions. This is not randomness. It is a rhythm. These patterns suggest that humans were not only surviving the Ice Age, they were organising it. They were mapping it into their lives, creating invisible blueprints of function and memory. Some archaeologists believe the layout of hearths and bedding areas reflects social structures. Elders near the fire, children along the edges, or perhaps gendered divisions of labour. We can't be certain. The clues are faint. But they are there. And then there is the hearth itself, placed with care, fed with fuel, framed with stone. The hearth was not merely a place for heat. It was a social engine, the heart of the shelter, the glow that shaped conversation, craft, and sleep. Where they placed it tells us where they gathered, how they rested, what they saw as the centre. In this, we glimpse not just architecture, but intention. And that intention begins to shift, depending on the season, the landscape, and the size of the group. Shelter was never one size fits all. In warmer months, mobility mattered more than permanence. Lightweight dwellings, collapsible frames, and the memory of place guided these early migrations across familiar terrain. But come winter, shelter transformed. It became denser, heavier, a womb of sorts, dug in, wrapped in mammoth hide, rib bone and turf. Some shelters, especially in the open steppes, reveal sophisticated structural thinking. Mammoth bones aren't just stacked, they're engineered. Tusk arches support crossbeams, skulls anchor corners. Ribs form natural curvature for walls. These were not random assemblages. They were frameworks of intent, stitched with ropes, braced with ice, reinforced against the wind. One site, dating back nearly 1500 years, shows clear layering of hearth ash year after year. In some areas, red ochre stains the floor. Elsewhere, fragments of shells, fossil coral, and beads appear. These aren't necessities, they're aesthetics, memory objects, ornaments to tether the temporary to something more enduring. The more archaeologists study these spaces, the more they resemble homes in the fullest sense. Not just enclosures from weather, but centers of life. Crafting, storytelling, healing. Some mammoth huts are large enough to host several families, while others are small and intimate, perhaps seasonal stops for smaller bands. And inside these spaces, patterns emerge. In one zone, flint napping debris; in another, bone tools, stacked or discarded. Near the hearth, teeth from animals, split and burned. This organization isn't casual. It reflects choice, familiarity, perhaps even rules. Some archaeologists now speak of domestic architecture when referring to these Paleolithic shelters. It's a term that honors their complexity, their permanence, their design, and it reminds us that long before bricks and blueprints, humans were already sketching their world in the grammar of space. Because how we live together is one of the oldest technologies of all. Walls may rise from necessity, but rooms are born from culture. Culture, in this sense, leaves traces in arrangement, in placement, in repetition. The choice to set the fire pits slightly off-center, the curve of sleeping nests following the wall's interior, the shell bead tucked into a mammoth jawbone, found not outside but within the ring. These details whisper intention, not just survival, but something more, reflective, perhaps even aesthetic. It is in these subtle arrangements that some archaeologists begin to see the flicker of symbolic thought, the beginnings of ritual space. Hearths aren't just functional, they're focal. Like altars, they gather attention, they bind group rhythms, they offer both heat and horizon. And if we trace this idea further, we find clues not only in where people slept, but in how they shaped their social space. Central hearths, repeated across different sites and time periods, suggest shared mental templates, not blueprints drawn by hand, but designs carried in memory, handed down, told through demonstration, retained in rhythm. Younger members of a band may have grown up watching their elders shape camp circles, tie sinew knots, layer insulation in the wind-facing wall. These were not idle actions. They were teaching moments, encoded memory, passed through muscle, gesture, and repetition. And so even the act of building a hut, of placing a stone here, a jawbone there, becomes a kind of storytelling, an inheritance of knowledge, embodied in the very materials of shelter. In some sites, coloured pigments have been found within dwelling spaces, red ochre, often smeared near hearths or bones. Did these markings hold meaning? Were they part of rituals? Did they bless the space, mark territory, commemorate the dead? We don't know, but the act itself of marking, staining, decorating suggests a kind of mindfulness, an urge to transform shelter into a statement, and sometimes the statement is silent. Absences, too, are part of this language. Gaps in hearth placement, empty zones within otherwise cluttered huts. These voids may have held significance. Space for dreaming, for mourning, for solitude. The Ice Age was not only a world of cold, but of vastness, of distance, and shelter may have been the first boundary drawn between the inner and the outer, the sacred and the shared. In the faint lines of floor plans buried beneath layers of loess and ash, we glimpse not just architecture but ethos, a way of being, a choice to shape the world, not just in response to it, but as an extension of it. So when we speak of shelters as strategies, we are not only describing technology, we are describing a worldview. Worldview is built not only in structures, but in habits, the daily choreography of warmth, distance, proximity, and care. And nowhere is this more gently illustrated than in how early humans organized their sleeping circles, their cooking spaces, their entrances. One might imagine a mother settling a child near the heat, an elder positioned beside the main entry to greet returning hunters. Perhaps an unspoken rhythm guided these placements, a kind of social gravity, repeating across years, across generations, until it became the unspoken blueprint of a culture. Inside these spaces, light and shadow mattered. A fire doesn't just warm, it reveals, it frames faces, it pushes back the night. Some huts show signs of reflective surfaces, bones or stone arranged to amplify the glow. Others include openings to the east, inviting sunrise to fall upon the hearth. Orientation was not arbitrary. It was tuned to sky, season, wind, and in that tuning, a kind of cosmology takes shape. To place a shelter on the land is one thing. To align it with the stars or the sun, to make it part of a greater rhythm, is something else entirely. These early shelters, then, are more than debris. They are decisions, frozen in dust. They whisper how people once saw the world, not only as something to survive, but as something to belong to. And perhaps, at the centre of each hearth, amid ash and charcoal, they told stories, the first blueprints of memory, passed not through diagrams, but through flame-lit eyes and the slow gestures of hands in the cold. What we build around us, the huts, the hearths, the sharpened stones, is only part of the story. Within those Paleolithic shelters and snow-covered plains, something softer, quieter, and more ephemeral shaped the rhythm of daily life. We just can't see it anymore. The haunting question, then, is this. What technologies held prehistoric life together, but left no trace in the ground beneath our feet? We tend to imagine prehistory in hard edges and chipped stone. Those are the artifacts that survive. The flint, the bone, the carved ivory. They are the fossils of intention, the material shadows that endure across deep time. But for every stone tool we find, how many vanished tools once coexisted? Tools made not of rock, but of reed. Not carved, but knotted, coiled, or soaked. There are whispers of this other world, buried not in solid rock, but in soil layers so fragile that the wind could carry them away. In the Czech site of Dolní Věstonice, archaeologists uncovered tiny impressions in clay, what looked like cordage patterns, as if a net had once rested upon the wet earth. At Lascaux, there are hints of woven material preserved in pigments. In a German site called Holy Fels, twisted fibres were found beside worked ivory. They don't scream for attention. These aren't weapons. These are the ligaments of survival, baskets, slings, fishnets, woven mats. Technology not meant to kill, but to carry, cradle, and contain. And if we squint through time, just right, we begin to see how pervasive they may have been. Think of the simple act of binding a stone blade to a stick. You need something to hold it in place, a thread, a strip of sinew, a length of fibre soaked and twisted. Hafting didn't work without this soft technology, and yet the bindings themselves are almost always gone. So, archaeologists turn to indirect evidence. To the telltale polish on a stone where a rope may have rubbed. To notches and grooves that suggest bindings were once there. They analyse residues, microscopic traces of plant fibre, chemical ghosts on ancient adhesives. It is forensic science in the purest sense, chasing a story told by absence rather than presence. There is something strangely poetic about this, that the technologies that may have touched the skin most closely, clothing, twine, sandals, straps, are the ones least likely to endure. They were made to be soft, to flex and bend. But softness does not mean simplicity. Spinning thread requires rhythm. Weaving a basket demands spatial memory and abstraction. Plating strands into cords calls upon a sense of pattern and tension. These were not crude inventions. They were intricate forms of knowledge, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. And yet, they dissolved into water, into soil, into silence. So, how do we resurrect them? Not with bones, not with stones, but with imagination and with experiment. Experimental archaeology is the art of remembering with the hands. It begins with a question that can't be answered in a lab. How would this feel? How would it behave? What if we tried? In the absence of surviving materials, researchers have turned to process. They strip bark from trees, twist grass into cords, soak nettles, scrape flax. They try, again and again, to rediscover the gestures that once held Ice Age life together. Some use stone tools, staying as faithful as possible to prehistoric methods. Others use controlled modern tools to measure tensile strength, wear rates, and decay patterns. Through this craft, a hidden layer of prehistory begins to reappear. A replica net, for instance, made from willow bast and modelled on impressions found in ancient clay, can be tested in shallow rivers. How much weight does it hold? What size fish does it catch? How quickly does it rot? Suddenly, questions become tactile. Hypotheses become soaked, knotted, and frayed. In one experiment, archaeologists tried reproducing sandals from the dry caves of the American Southwest. They wove yucca fiber and palm leaves into soles. Then they walked. On dirt, on stone, on ice. They wore them through. What emerged wasn't just a durable product. It was a memory, a sense of how far someone could travel in a day, how often repairs were needed, and how many hands it might take to supply a band with footwear. This approach doesn't offer definitive answers. It does something deeper. It gives us a vocabulary of movement. The twist of the wrist, the tension in the fingers, the endurance of a back bent over a mat. These are stories that don't fossilize. But when we replicate them, we begin to feel, viscerally, the knowledge that prehistoric people once carried in their bodies, and from there, we begin to notice new things in the archaeological record. Suddenly, a row of post holes in ancient soil might suggest a loom frame. A grove of pliable saplings near a river might signal a basket-making site. A cluster of microliths near a hearth might not just be tools for hunting, but for cutting plant fiber, stripping bark, slicing roots. The world of stone becomes the world of thread. Experimental archaeology reminds us that technology is not always what survives. Sometimes it is what leaves no trace at all, but whose absence reshapes the meaning of everything else. And in a quiet way, these lost tools, these fibers, baskets and nets, begin to feel less like artifacts and more like conversations. Not shouted, not etched in stone, but whispered through time. From hand to hand, it is in this whispering silence that the weight of the missing becomes most profound. Consider the woven basket. It seems humble. But what does it mean? To carry. To transport berries, roots, or kindling across a landscape. The invention of the basket transformed not just how much could be gathered, but when and where it could be used. Gathering was no longer a series of isolated actions. It became a system, a loop, a circuit of provisioning, storing, moving. With containers came continuity, and with continuity came planning. A net, too, reshaped more than the act of catching. It expanded what tool could mean. No longer a single handheld object, the net was a system-wide web of intention, spanning space, coordinated in teams, placed with forethought, left to work invisibly. It was a leap in cognition, a tool that operated while the maker was elsewhere. That's not just technology, that's trust. Then there is rope. Twisting fibre into cordage is a deeply recursive act. 3 strands become one, then 3 of those become another. Braiding, reversing, pulling, it is algorithmic thinking, done without symbols. Cordage binds not just tools, but people, in traps, in bundles, in clothing, in cradle boards. It held the Ice Age world together, quietly, uncelebrated, and utterly essential. Yet cordage is nearly always missing from the archaeological record. So, archaeologists look for clues in the objects that remain. Where marks on antler tines may indicate weaving tools. Grooves in stones may be for softening or splitting fibre. Tiny holes drilled in pendants may have once held threaded beads. Even the placement of bones in graves can offer hints, suggesting once-bound bodies, now free of their wrappings. This is detective work at the edge of visibility. What these traces suggest is a toolkit, not of force, but of flexibility. These were tools that adapted, folding, stretching, winding through cracks in the known world. They didn't command attention, they offered solutions, and they speak, too, of a different kind of intelligence. To make a stone tool is to shape what is already hard. But to make rope, To weave, to net, is to transform what is soft. It demands an intuition for texture, an ability to feel resistance, to anticipate fray, to coordinate motion over time. These are not lesser skills. They are complex, precise, and profoundly human, and yet, because they do not last, they have long been ignored. In doing so, we've built a lopsided vision of the past, one where men hunted and tools cut, and everything else is footnote. But these fiber technologies invite a different story. A story where carrying, weaving, bundling, and building were the foundation of survival. A story told not in blades but in threads. Across the millennia, the invisible tools of prehistory drift through our hands like shadows, faint but formative. What emerges, slowly, is the realization that fiber technology may not have been secondary to survival. It may have been central. Let us imagine, for a moment, the day-to-day life of a small Paleolithic group moving across tundra or forest edge. The blades and points may catch the eye in museums, but how many hours were spent gathering flexible willow, drying reeds, or rubbing sinew between fingers to soften it for cord? How much of human life was tied, literally, by twine? A shelter didn't stand without bindings. A baby couldn't be swaddled without slings. Firewood, food, sleeping mats, even social customs, so many were bundled, suspended, or adorned with fibre. This soft architecture framed the living world. Some scholars now argue that cordage may predate even stone tools. The act of twisting two plant fibres together may have been one of the earliest cognitive experiments in controlled patterning. It's possible that some form of rope existed hundreds of thousands of years before the earliest known basket impressions. We can't prove it, but we can reconstruct the logic. And the logic is compelling. Twisting fibre is an intuitive action. Children do it. It requires no tools, only hands and attention. Once made, cordage multiplies its uses. It can lash, pull, carry, suspend, adorn. This mutability is part of its genius. Its very formlessness allows it to shape into function, yet because it leaves so little behind, it risks being forgotten. But if we follow its absence long enough, it loops us back to presence. At Paleolithic sites where stone tools are found in distinct clusters, some archaeologists now suggest that these may have once been toolkits bound together, knives, scrapers, and flakes held in fibre wraps. The shapes and wear patterns hint at portability. The distribution of objects across a site begins to feel not random, but planned, organised by function, separated by activity, maybe even bundled by the owner. We see this too in burial sites. A pierced tooth here, a small shell there, spaced as if once strung. Graves do not just tell us how people died, they hint at how people lived, and fibre, even in its absence, traces a line through these clues. What we call ephemeral was, in truth, enduring in motion, in memory, in repetition. There is a deeper lesson in this, one that threads beyond prehistory. Not all tools are loud, not all inventions are made of stone and fire. Some dissolve into silence, but that silence is not emptiness. It is filled with the touch of hands, the softness of bark, the rhythm of a braided past, a memory braided into absence. In that braided past, what lingers is not just what was made, but how it was shared. Fibre technologies were rarely solitary endeavours. They were practiced in circles, around fires, in quiet afternoons between hunts, passed from hand to smaller hand. These were not just tasks, they were teachings. The thread ran through generations, and with it, knowledge moved. Not in books, not even in words, always, but in fingers, gestures, rhythms, a grandmother's method for looping cord, a child's first woven loop, repetition as memory, practice as legacy. This is what the archaeological record cannot show, but what experimental archaeology can hint toward, what living traditions around the world still carry. In indigenous communities from Australia to the Arctic, fibre crafts are not just tools, they are identity. A woven bag is a lineage, a knotted net is a language. Even today, these acts resist the binary of tool and art. They are both. Utility shaped into beauty, and beauty worn into survival. By reweaving this ancient thread into our understanding of Ice Age life, we also restore a fuller image of who we were, not just hunters and firemakers, not only flint knappers and mammoth trackers, but spinners, weavers, netters, binders, carriers of soft skill. We begin to recognize that the Ice Age was not only an era of cold and stone, but of intimacy and ingenuity. A world where survival did not always roar, it rustled, it creaked, it twined. The overlooked tools, the forgotten tools, are often the most human. They remind us that technology is not a march of sharper edges. It is a web of connections spun quietly in the background. They challenge the myth that innovation is always loud, heroic, and permanent. Sometimes it is quiet, shared, and meant to vanish. Sometimes the tools that do not fossilize are the ones we carried longest. And so, as we move forward into the next part of this story, let us carry this idea like a strand of fibre, that the foundations of survival are not always carved in stone. Some are braided into the body, some are whispered through the hand, and some, even when they vanish, still hold the shape of our presence. Some tools vanish without a trace, others leave behind 1,000 pieces, scattered in the soil like punctuation from a long-forgotten conversation. These shards, the flakes, chips and splinters of flint, are more than just debris. They're what archaeologists call debitage, and they speak in the quiet language of learning. Not the thunder of invention, but the whisper of repetition. How do we know when a tool becomes a lesson? The question might seem impossible to answer. After all, we cannot peer back in time to watch a young child shape their first blade, or see the hands of a mentor guiding those of an apprentice. But we can examine the scars left in stone. Sometimes, a site contains dozens of crude flakes near a finely worked spear point, or a large cluster of imperfect cuts, followed by a smaller one of clean, confident strikes. The pattern is telling. It suggests something that sounds almost modern, a learning curve. In certain Paleolithic sites, especially in Europe and the Levant, we see areas where less skilled knappers practiced, often beside more expert artisans. A place like Grotte du Rennais in France reveals stratified layers of debitage that vary in precision and form. Some flakes are large and clumsy, others are thin and neat, struck with elegance. This kind of variation isn't random. It looks eerily like teaching. And teaching, of course, implies more than just technique. It points to time, patience, attention, a willingness to invest in the future. By slowing down the present, this may be the real shift, the moment when tools stop being merely objects and begin to carry stories. A blade can be remade, but the method of making it, that must be transmitted. The clues continue. In some regions, toolmakers used more stone than strictly necessary, producing dozens of practice pieces for every finished item. Why waste so much precious material, unless someone was learning? Unless this was a kind of Paleolithic classroom. Of course, no blackboards or written scripts mark these lessons. But that's what makes the archaeological patterns all the more fascinating. Without books or schools, knowledge still travelled. It travelled through demonstration and imitation, through trial and error, through the slow, deliberate craft of watching and doing. What's even more striking is that we don't just find single types of tools repeating, we find sequences, step-by-step procedures, carefully repeated across time and space. One strike to prepare a platform, another to shape the edge, a third to detach the blade. These aren't random gestures, they're choreography. And when we see choreography, we must ask, who was watching? Because learning is rarely silent, not in its impact, not in its aftermath. Each misstrike holds the ghost of a question. Each clean flake, the glimmer of understanding. The rocks are mute, but the patterns are not. They hum with instruction. And this brings us to a deeper mystery. If knowledge could be taught, could it also be remembered? Could it be stored, shaped, and passed on, not just as skill, but as culture? When knowledge begins to move through time, something profound begins to change in a species. No longer bound by instinct alone, the individual becomes a vessel for a larger continuity, a thread that stretches backward and forward, weaving generations together. In Ice Age communities, this continuity wasn't written, but it was felt. It lived in our hands, in my eyes, in stone. Cultural transmission is one of the most powerful forces in the human story. Unlike simple imitation, where one might copy the final shape of a tool, true teaching involves sequence, cause and effect, nuance. It's the difference between seeing a spear and understanding why it must be thinned along its spine. It's not enough to reproduce the product. You must grasp the process. This depth of understanding leaves traces, not just in the tools themselves, but in how they cluster across time. Archaeologists studying sites thousands of miles apart have noticed something startling. In some cases, tools separated by continents and centuries bear uncannily similar design principles. The same way of retouching a blade or notching a point for hafting. The resemblance is too precise, too deliberate to be coincidence. This is the fingerprint of shared tradition, and it raises a quiet, staggering possibility that early humans were not only teaching within groups, but carrying those teachings with them as they migrated. Imagine a family moving across the steppe, across rivers, through forests. In their packs, they carry more than meat and flint. They carry a way of doing things, a way of being. This is not instinct, this is inheritance. But unlike genetic inheritance, this form of continuity can adapt within a single lifetime. A skilled napper might refine a method, pass it to their apprentice, who then adds a twist of their own. Over time, these innovations accumulate, not chaotically, but within the framework of a cultural tradition. Like language, it grows. Indeed, many researchers now view toolmaking and language as twin evolutions. Both require sequencing. Both demand abstraction. Both depend on the learner seeing not just what is done, but why. It's not a stretch to imagine that the first lessons in human history were neither words nor drawings, but stones. In this way, a sharp edge became a medium for transmission. A shaped core became a sentence of intention. When passed down carefully, these technologies did more than cut. They bound. And what bound the group wasn't just survival. It was an identity. Because over time, as techniques evolved, different groups began to develop distinct styles of tool-making. Slight preferences, local variations, a curve here, a thinner edge there. This regional flavour, this archaeological dialect, forms the first whisper of cultural identity. A tool could tell you where someone came from, who taught them, what mattered. This wasn't mass production, it was memory, napped into stone. Some of the earliest hints of identity in the archaeological record are not marks on cave walls, but the edges of flint. When viewed through the slow lens of deep time, a stone tool is not just a function, it becomes a fingerprint. And like all fingerprints, it carries something quietly personal, even when made by many hands. Regional styles in toolmaking are not simply functional variations, they reflect taste, habit, choice. Why else would one group prefer long, elegant blades while another shapes their points short and wide? Why would the same raw material, struck in similar conditions, yield such differing forms? These are not random acts of adaptation, they are decisions. At sites like Solutré in France or Kostenki in Russia, we see these patterns emerge. Across thousands of years, stone tools evolve within each group like accents, slowly shifting, but still traceable to their roots. The methods are shared, yes, but the execution is distinct, local, familiar, and this distinction becomes even more visible when groups come into contact. In the archaeological layers, we sometimes find blended styles, tools that borrow from two traditions, combining techniques or reshaping forms. These transitional artifacts are like conversations. They suggest that knowledge was not just preserved, it was exchanged. This kind of interaction points to something extraordinary. Cultural memory had become mobile. It wasn't just that people carried tools, they carried aesthetics, methods, values, and when two groups met, through trade, conflict, or marriage, what they exchanged may have included more than goods. They exchanged ideas. Here, in the chipping of stone, lies one of the earliest records of cultural diffusion. Of course, we cannot know how these exchanges felt. There are no voices preserved, no written treaties, but what we do have is an ever-branching tree of tool traditions, some growing in isolation, others braided together. This tree reveals a world not of uniformity, but of divergence and reconnection, a world where identity was shaped, quite literally, in the palm of the hand. This may be the origin of belonging, To craft a tool in the style of your people was to mark your place within them. It was a gesture of continuity, of shared memory, the same way a modern person might cook their grandmother's recipe or wear a symbol passed down through generations. It is this continuity that transforms utility into culture, and within that culture, the transmission of tools became something more. It became a language of signs, shared not just for survival, but for meaning. For the joy of doing it the right way, the way your people always had. When a child watched their elder flake stone, they learned more than just how to hunt. They learned how to be someone, not just a person with skills, but a person with a past, even without speech, even without script. The rhythm of hands working stone could echo across generations. One flake at a time, a shared knowledge took form, not in the air, but in the wrists, in the weight of motion, in the silence between strikes. This was literacy of another kind, and in that silence, there was structure. Recent studies of flint knapping patterns suggest that tool-making follows sequences not unlike syntax. Specific gestures occur in predictable order. One motion enables the next. The process must unfold with precision, or the result will fail. Like language, it's hierarchical, recursive. If we imagine thoughts being nested inside one another, plans within plans, then these tools were more than practical. They were spatial sentences. And where there are sentences, there is memory. Teaching this sequence would have required not just showing the shape, but guiding the feel, the force, the posture. An elder might tap a child's wrist, adjust their grip, repeat the strike. Again, and again, and again. Not until the tool was perfect, but until the student understood why each step mattered. This is pedagogy without words, and the lesson was never just the tool. It was the ritual of its making, a shared vocabulary of motion that could not be learned overnight. It had to be lived, practiced, trusted. Such knowledge, passed hand to hand, is not fragile. It's resilient, because every new napper carries the full inheritance of those before them. And yet, this inheritance is not frozen. From time to time, the archaeological record reveals something unusual. A new flaking pattern, a novel core preparation, a retouch that doesn't fit the usual mold. Often, these innovations appear briefly, then disappear. But sometimes, they spread. Slowly at first, then widely. What causes this? Some suggest it is the mark of a particularly gifted individual, a kind of prehistoric innovator whose new method outperformed the old. Others believe such changes may emerge accidentally, then become canonized through teaching. Either way, the key is not invention, but transmission. For an idea to survive, it must be taught, and to be taught, it must be seen. This is why experimental archaeologists speak of visibility in flaking techniques. Some methods are more observable than others. Some require a mentor to slow down, to allow the learner to witness the critical step. A gesture too fast, a flake too small, and the whole process becomes invisible, which brings us to a subtle, beautiful question. Did early humans change how they moved to make their knowledge visible? If so, then tool-making was not just individual skill, it was social performance. Every lesson, every flake, was a moment of connection between people across time, and in those connections, we see the beginnings of something larger than survival. We see tradition. Tradition is not only the act of repeating what came before, it is the quiet decision to carry it forward. It's a choice made again and again, even when the landscape changes, even when the game moves on, even when the stones grow scarce. In the long Ice Age nights, when the fire crackled low and the wind pressed close to the shelter walls, tradition may have been one of the few certainties, because to pass on a way of making, whether a point, a scraper, or a blade, was to pass on a way of thinking. By the end of the Upper Paleolithic, this process had become astonishingly sophisticated. Across Europe and into Asia, clusters of artifacts show consistent, localized variation, styles that remain stable for generations. In places like the Magdalenian of Western Europe or the Epigravettian in the East, archaeologists find not just tools, but recognizable signatures. Preferred forms, favorite techniques. These are not accidents, they are traditions embodied in stone. Such persistence suggests that teaching had become embedded in the very rhythm of daily life. Children likely learned by proximity, watching, mimicking, failing, refining. Perhaps each campsite had its own experts, its own way of doing things. Knowledge may have been decentralized, passed laterally as well as vertically, from peer to peer, across generations and between them. And in this dense web of learning, group identity became reinforced. Your way of making was your way, not just in function, but in feeling. It was how you knew where you belonged. This had subtle but powerful consequences, because once identity is tied to method, change becomes difficult. Innovation must be justified. It must not only work, it must fit. This doesn't mean Paleolithic people were resistant to new ideas, but it does suggest that ideas had to move through channels of trust. Before a new tool shape could be accepted, it had to be taught. Before it could be taught, it had to be understood, not just technically, but culturally. This is how knowledge becomes legacy, and legacy leaves traces that even time cannot fully erase. When modern archaeologists uncover a cluster of blades that share the same proportions, the same pressure-flaked edge, they are reading a story told without language. A story of care, of practice, of minds shaped by other minds, and perhaps, if we squint just right, we can glimpse the memory that moved between them. A memory not stored in bones or genes, but in gestures, in rhythm, in stone. The tool, once just an extension of the hand, had become something greater. It was now an extension of the mind, and the mind, in turn, had become a vessel for the group, a bearer of its past and a steward of its future. In this quiet dance of teaching and making, something ancient stirred, the roots of culture, not the loud painted rituals of myth, but the steady pulse of meaning, passed hand to hand. The tool had become a language, a bearer of its past and a steward of its future. The human mind, shaped by stone, stood now at the edge of something unfamiliar. The cold was fading, the rhythm of the world was shifting, and with it, the landscapes that had shaped so many generations began to soften. No longer locked beneath glaciers, the earth exhaled. Forests crept across once frozen steppes. Rivers, swollen with meltwater, carved new paths. Herds of reindeer, woolly mammoth, and giant elk, the anchors of Ice Age survival, migrated or vanished. In their place came roe deer, wild boar, and trout, familiar but different. Predictable, but not easy. Where once survival was about specialization, long spears for mammoth, massive throws for bison, now it has become a game of range, of adaptation, and humans, ever listening, responded. This was not an age of grand new shapes. It was a time of shrinking scale and expanding flexibility. The microlith had no grandeur. It was a sliver of stone, sharp but small, often barely the length of a fingertip. Alone, it did little. But when set into wood or bone, rows of them aligned like tiny teeth, it became something more. A barbed point, a sickle edge, a fishing harpoon. This was the composite revolution. Tools were no longer singular. They were modular, built from parts, replaceable, upgradable. If a microlith broke, another could be slotted in. The haft stayed intact. The form endured. This approach mirrored the world that was emerging, fragmented, diverse, in motion. It was a quiet revolution of design, and it demanded new kinds of thought. Because where older tools might have been passed down intact, a flint axe cherished, a spearhead napped and retouched, these newer ones invited assembly. They asked the maker to plan not just the edge, but the interface. How will this bind to that? How will sinew hold the flint? How will heat soften the resin? Each decision echoed a new kind of cognition, part engineering, part intuition, and behind it, a changed tempo of life. Broad-spectrum foraging replaced Ice Age specialization. Where once a single kill could feed many, now sustenance required accumulation. Mussels from tidal flats, hazelnuts from groves, fish from rivers, tubers, fruits, birds, and more. Food was everywhere, but never in excess. And this meant the toolkit had to follow. Versatility became survival. The bow appeared, not for the first time, but with increasing frequency. Fishing gear diversified. Bone hooks, net weights, floats carved from wood. Traps were devised for birds and small mammals. Storage pits emerged, dug into earth, lined with bark or hide. These were not desperate adaptations. They were deliberate, and they suggest something deeper, that humans were not just reacting to change. They were anticipating it, sensing new rhythms in the land and tuning their technologies accordingly. The cold had given way to a world less absolute, less stable, and in that space of uncertainty, innovation bloomed, not loudly but steadily. But adaptation was not only a matter of reshaping tools, it was a reshaping of thought itself, honed through countless generations, raised under wide skies and shifting seasons. The retreat of the glaciers did not unfold overnight. It was a slow exhalation across millennia, an inhale of warmer air creeping northward year by year, carrying with it new species, new plants, and unfamiliar rhythms. For the people who lived through this profound transformation, survival meant paying attention, and attention, in these years, meant becoming many kinds of gatherer, not just one kind of hunter. This is where the archaeological record begins to whisper of something often called the broad spectrum revolution, a shift in human subsistence that widened the focus from big game hunting to the gathering of a wide range of smaller, more varied food sources. Shellfish, seeds, tubers, berries, small mammals, birds, all began to enter the story more prominently. But what exactly does this have to do with tools? Perhaps more than we first imagine, because when diets diversify, so too must the instruments that secure them. And this is the curious thing. The later Paleolithic and early Mesolithic toolkits don't simplify. They multiply. Bladelets were joined by scrapers, burins, microliths, harpoons, and fishing weights, often in startlingly localized combinations. In some places, we find bone hooks shaped with such care that you'd think they belong to a craftsman, not a survivor. In others, flint crescents, designed to be inset into wooden shafts with plant resin and sinew, created light and deadly barbed arrows, more effective for bringing down deer than mammoths. The question, then, is what these evolving toolkits tell us about cognition, not just the tools themselves, but the mental frameworks required to invent and maintain them. For the first time in our species' story, we begin to see evidence of highly variable, context-dependent solutions, people adjusting rapidly to their local ecologies rather than adhering to a dominant technological tradition. This isn't the rigid learning of rote technique. This is flexibility, plasticity, a mind trained not only to remember, but to improvise. And in the bones and stone chips left behind, we can begin to trace this shift. Take, for instance, the famed site of Star Carr in what is now northern England. Once a lakeside encampment, now a peat-preserved memory, it has yielded fishing implements, barbed points, and even headdresses made from deer skulls. Here, tools were not just used, they were adapted, modified, tested against the wet, boggy land, and then remade. At Star Carr, survival meant iteration, but it wasn't only the tools themselves that were changing. It was the spaces in which they were made, and perhaps even the roles of those who made them. With increased diversity came increased interdependence. Some hunted, some fished. Some gathered plants whose roots required grinding or roasting, and each task came with its own miniature technology. So what happens to a society when its tools fragment, not into chaos, but into complexity? That's the quiet revolution hiding behind this proliferation of implements. It isn't just a scatter of function, it's a map of minds, flexible, observant, prepared to trade depth for breadth, mastery for adaptability. To navigate a world no longer shaped by ice, humans had to reimagine how tools fit into the story of daily life, not only in what they could do, but in how they were made, repaired, and even carried. Gone were the days when a single stone hand axe might serve for years. In its place rose a new ethos: mobility, modularity, redundancy. A single toolkit now contained dozens of interchangeable pieces: flint blades for cutting, bone needles for sewing, fish hooks of antler, and carved barbs of microlithic stone, bound into shafts with birch pitch and sinew. It was a dispersed intelligence, held not in any one object, but in the relationships between them. This mosaic of tools mirrored the shifting mosaic of the post-glacial world itself. landscapes changed quickly. Forests advanced, rivers altered course, coastal zones rose and fell. The people who moved through these terrains had to think not just in terms of what worked, but in terms of what could be carried. Portability became a design principle. Tools needed to be light, collapsible, repairable on the move. The microlith was perfect for this, but these changes went deeper than logistics. They hinted at a more subtle transformation, a change in the rhythm of life, and perhaps even in how time itself was experienced. Seasonal cycles grew less extreme but more complex. Fish swam upriver in particular months. Nuts ripened, then vanished. Deer shed antlers. Birds migrated. Each resource had a window, and each tool had its moment. The world demanded a new kind of memory, not of stone, but of sequence. And this is where we must pause to appreciate how intimately cognition is woven into tool use. These weren't just objects to wield. They were invitations to remember. A hook meant spring. A net weight signalled summer's shoals. A grinding slab suggested a season of seeds. This was an embodied calendar, carved not into rock walls but into the hands and habits of its users. Archaeologists sometimes speak of the composite toolkit as a technical milestone, but in truth, it was also an epistemological one, a new way of knowing. Each component depended on another. The pitch must be heated before it can bind. The shaft must be cured so it won't splinter. The microlith must be precisely shaped to sit flush. There is no hierarchy here, only interrelation. And that meant that knowledge, too, had to circulate. No one person could carry it all. Craft became collaborative. This, perhaps, was the hidden gift of the warming earth. As the certainty of mammoth hunts receded into memory, something else emerged. A more fluid, more resilient understanding of how to live with change. Not to fight it, but to flow with it. And in the flint flakes, the birch tar, the fish bones, and the ash pits of long-forgotten hearths, we can glimpse the early threads of this new ethos, adapted not by strength but by subtlety. If subtlety was the new strength, then the tools of this era reveal a mind attuned to nuance, not only in materials but in ecosystems. What emerged in these post-Ice Age cultures was not a single breakthrough or dramatic invention, but a kind of quiet attunement to place. Technology became less about domination, more about interpretation. To survive in an unstable world, one had to become a reader of signs. Consider the Mesolithic sites near the rivers and marshes of what is now Denmark or the Netherlands. There, archaeologists uncover layers of shell middens, delicate fish bones, and tools carved from red deer antlers, worked into points, tines, and barbed harpoons. It is not the scale of the tools that is impressive, but the specificity. It is the intimacy of their knowledge that stands out, each design a hypothesis drawn from observation, tested again and again by trial and error. And this knowledge was deeply local. A group living near reeds would know how to weave them into traps. A coastal community would master tidal rhythms. A highland forager might learn the patterns of migrating birds or berries that flush in open clearings after fire. Tools became regional dialects, subtle accents of wood, bone, and flint shaped by environment, season, and need. There is a word that fits this moment in the human story: eco-technical. It is the fusion of technology with ecology, a recognition that tools are not static, but living participants in an unfolding relationship with the land. This is where we begin to see hints of what would much later become agriculture. Not yet the planting of crops, but the planting of intention, the shaping of tools not just for today's survival, but for tomorrow's return. And so, the edge of change sharpened not just the blade, but the awareness behind it. Even fire, once a defensive warmth against the cold, began to take on new dimensions. In this warming world, fire became a tool of transformation. It hardened wood, boiled roots, cleared land, and reshaped the boundaries between wild and tame. Fire no longer simply responded to the elements, it manipulated them, and with it, people began to experiment. They burned patches of forest to attract grazing animals. They cooked toxic tubers to make them edible. They created long-burning hearths that offered not just heat, but smoke, a natural insect repellent. Each of these was a kind of laboratory, guided not by abstract theory, but by generations of sensory knowledge. And in each case, tools followed. Scrapers to prepare hides for mosquito-dense wetlands, digging sticks for roots, stone mortars for nuts. The line between tool and environment blurred. Tools were no longer separate from the world. They were an extension of how people moved through it. This weaving together of tool and terrain, of season and skill, place and practice, did more than just help humans survive. It reshaped how they perceived themselves in relation to the world. With the Ice Age ending, the harsh certainties of glacial life gave way to subtler puzzles. No longer hemmed in by cold or scarcity, people began to ask not just how to endure, but how to belong. In the shifting edges of lakes and meadows, in forests expanding where once there was only tundra, humans carved out niches not by muscle, but by memory. The microliths, fish hooks, resin-glued blades, and barbed points were not just responses to new prey or climate. They were reflections of a more intricate understanding of interdependence. A new tool was no longer just an object, it was a commitment to a place, a way of moving and knowing shaped by rhythm, not reaction. Perhaps most telling of this era are the sites where tools are found not only in use, but in rest, carefully cached in pits, tucked into woven baskets, sometimes even placed beside the dead. These were not random discard piles, they were statements. The people who buried these objects were saying, "This matters, this will matter again." In these caches, we find the earliest hints of legacy. The climate had changed. So had the tools. But beneath both, the most remarkable transformation was internal. People had learned to shape not just objects, but futures. This moment at the end of the Ice Age is not the end of the human story, nor even the end of tools. But it marks a threshold. The great glacial behemoths were retreating, and in their wake came not just warmer winds and rising waters, but new questions. What do we keep from the past? What must we invent for what lies ahead? The answer, as always, was carried in the hands, in bone and flint, in pitch and fibre, in the quiet genius of the composite toolkit, and in the minds of those who saw not just a warmer earth but a world full of possibility. Where once humans had wielded tools to carve through ice and hunger, now they shaped them to cultivate meaning, memory, and motion. The edge of change had arrived, and rather than resist, they leaned into it, carving with finer hands the contours of the world to come. It is tempting to look at a stone tool and see only its edge, the sharpness, the form, the function. But the deeper truth lies not in the tool itself, but in the hand that shaped it. Because every flake struck from flint, every groove carved into bone, every woven strand of fibre carries with it not only the echo of survival, but the quiet persistence of memory. What does it mean for a hand to remember? This is not memory in the modern sense, not the flicker of a birthday recollection or a name retrieved from childhood. This is a memory stored not in the mind alone, but in the gestures that shape the world. A memory that survives the passage of time not as a story or a song, but as a technique. When we hold a tool, especially one made with care, we are not only holding an object, we are touching the residue of another's knowing. Someone else's muscles learned that motion. Someone else's eyes saw the right line. Someone else's hands made the decision to strike. And the strike after that. This is the hidden continuity that binds us to the past. Not the bones in the ground, but the hands that move through air above them. Some anthropologists have called this inactive memory, a type of knowledge stored in motion rather than words. We see its shadow in the archaeological record whenever a tool is repeated, again and again, with only minor variations. The Acheulean hand axe, appearing across thousands of kilometers and hundreds of thousands of years. The refined blades of the Upper Paleolithic, the microlithic crescent, shaped by deft fingers into precise geometry, and perhaps most importantly, we see it in the places where that continuity breaks. When a group migrates to a new environment, their tool forms shift, not because they forget, but because the land teaches them something new. In this way, memory and invention are not opposites. They are partners. One carries the thread, the other ties the knot. There is something deeply human in this act of remembering without words. It is not the cold efficiency of instinct, nor the formal abstraction of written knowledge. It is something in between. We might think of it as the craftsmanship of survival, a way of keeping one's ancestors close, even if their names are lost. Because every tool is, in a sense, a ghost, not a haunting, but a presence, an artifact of thought etched into matter. The hand that made it is long gone, but the curve of the edge, the polish of the grip, the angle of the strike, these remain, and in them we see not only how a tool was used, but how a life was lived. What mattered, what was noticed, what was passed on. This is the archaeology of memory, and its traces are everywhere. Not all memories, of course, can be seen. The stone remains, but the stories spoken beside the fire are gone. The basket left in the reeds, the cradle tied with sinew and patience, the song hummed softly while threading a bone needle. These vanish into the dark, leaving no artifact behind. And yet, we feel them. There is a silence in the archaeological record. Not just a gap in data, but a profound absence. A reminder that most of what made ancient life meaningful was not preserved in rock or bone. Love does not fossilize. Laughter leaves no imprint. A shared glance during a hunt, a whispered instruction during tool-making, the rhythm of bodies moving together in work or ritual, all of this, all that shaped the experience of being human, is gone. But we sense it in what remains. A delicate needle carved from ivory suggests more than cold-weather clothing. It hints at care and attention, and the unseen labour of hands who mended not only hides but relationships. A hearth, rebuilt again and again in the same cave corner, tells us about routine, not the dramatic heroism of survival, but the quiet repetition of domestic life. The kind of life that builds identity over time. The kind that teaches children how to hold a tool not just with strength, but with respect. In this way, the record becomes haunted by what it cannot show, and yet, perhaps that is its power. The very absence invites us to feel more deeply. We are asked to imagine not just how people survived, but what they valued, what they mourned, what they dreamed. This is where archaeology begins to touch philosophy, because when we study tools, we are not merely cataloguing artifacts, we are listening to questions that have no words. What do we owe the hands that came before us? And what will the things we leave behind say about us when we are no longer here to explain them? These are not questions of science alone. They are human questions, ethical questions, questions that ask us to recognize continuity not as a chain of invention, but as a tapestry of presence woven across time, across place, across death. The earliest tools were not made to last forever, but many of them did. And in doing so, they carry a message we still haven't fully translated. Not just how to make a blade, but how to remember being human. To remember being human is not simply to recall what we made. It is to understand why we made it. Invention is often framed as necessity's child, born of hunger, threat, or cold. But as we follow the long thread of Paleolithic craftsmanship, a quieter truth emerges. That many tools were also shaped by curiosity, by wonder, by the impulse to shape the world, not just because we must, but because we can. This becomes clearest when we encounter tools that exceed their function. Bone needles with subtle carvings, spear throwers shaped like birds, scrapers smoothed along edges, the hand never touched. These are not anomalies. They are insights. They remind us that even in eras dominated by survival, humans were always doing something more, investing the material world with meaning. The hand, it seems, never forgot beauty. And neither did it forget the story. Many archaeologists believe that tool traditions were passed not only through observation, but through teaching, perhaps even ritual. Children watched, imitated, failed. I tried again. Slowly, under patient instruction, they began to recognize the stone's language, the grain, the angle, the pressure. Not just what to strike, but when not to. What's passed on in these moments is more than knowledge. It is trust. To teach someone to make a tool is to say, you belong here. You are part of this. You carry what we carry. In this sense, tool use becomes a form of identity. Not just what a group does, but who they are. Styles emerge, regional flares, cultural fingerprints. An obsidian blade made in one valley differs subtly from one made across the ridge, not because of materials, but because of tradition. These traditions matter. They suggest that deep time is not a flat landscape, where every group is a blurred version of the next. It is textured, lived, peopled by communities with preferences, rhythms, and styles. Ways of doing that were taught, remembered, and repeated. Across generations. Across lifetimes. So when we find a certain notch, a certain curve, a familiar polish, we are not just seeing a tool, we are seeing continuity, a chain of hands, each one holding the knowledge of the last and passing it forward. This is the inheritance of gestures, and it is not gone. Many of the movements live on today, even if their objects have changed. The potter's hand, the calligrapher's wrist, the napper's eye, still practiced by experimental archaeologists who relearn the stone's voice. These are echoes. But they are not distant. They are the present reaching back, because the hand remembers what the mind forgets. And sometimes, what the hand remembers is everything. Everything in the end flows back through the hand. The marks left behind in ancient stone are not just signs of contact. They are signatures of thought. Every flake struck away, every edge refined, reflects a decision, a choice, a moment when instinct bent toward intention. These marks accumulate not randomly, but as patterns, as sequences, as stories etched in silence. But unlike writing, these stories were not meant to be read from afar. They were held, turned, used, understood through the rhythm of motion, not the abstraction of symbols. They were not texts. They were touched. And in that, they belong to a deeper kind of memory. Anthropologists speak of embodied knowledge, the wisdom stored not in the head, but in the body. In the way fingers curl around a shaft of wood, the way a foot presses into uneven ground. It is the knowledge that lives in repetition, in practice, in failure, followed by the quiet return. This kind of memory does not announce itself. It does not shout. It settles instead like sediment, layering over time, until an entire generation moves with the same grace, until the gesture becomes second nature, until a people without writing, without blueprints, can build shelters, shape tools, make fire, and traverse vast landscapes, guided not by map, but by memory that lives in the bones. This is what we inherit, not just the artifacts, but the way of learning that shaped them, a culture of craft, of doing by watching, of learning by doing, a culture that respected time because it was made of time. Knowledge passed hand to hand, without erasure. In this culture, patience was not optional, it was survival. Imagine a flint napper beside their child, a piece of stone between them. No words, perhaps, just the sound of stone meeting stone, the flicker of a glance when a flake breaks clean. The child watches, tries. The result is jagged, but the lesson is not lost. It is folded into the next attempt. And the next. One day, the flake will fall true. But more than that, the child will remember, not just how to strike, but how it felt to be taught. And in that, something quiet and lasting is born. Not a tool, a lineage, a chain not of genes, but of gestures. And if we listen to the past with enough humility, not as collectors of relics, but as inheritors of rhythm, we may begin to hear it. The low, unbroken hum of human continuity. A hand reaching forward, and another reaching back through every sharpened edge, every wound dressed with resin and sinew, every hollowed bone that once made music across the plains. There is a thread, and that thread is not just invention, it is remembrance. To remember in deep time is not merely to recall events, it is to re-inhabit conditions, to feel through the artifacts left behind, the textures of an ancient world, wind scraping across glacial stone, the creak of frozen branches, the smell of ochre on skin. These are not memories stored in sentences, they are stored in shapes, in tools, because a tool is never just a function, it is a response to hunger, to cold, to distance, a response to the presence of another, to care, to teaching, to need. And in responding, a tool becomes a message. It says, someone was here, someone met this world with open hands, and tried to shape it just enough to survive, just enough to stay, just enough to continue. The archaeological record is partial. Most of it is gone. The baskets, the nets, the gestures, the laughter. But even in what survives, scrapers, points, blades, we can sense the vastness of what was shared. The hum beneath the surface. That hum is still with us. You may feel it in the way you tie a knot, the way you stir a spoon, the way your thumb finds the groove in a worn handle. These are not new behaviors. They are echoes, ripples of a knowledge older than any alphabet, and yet not lost. In every generation, we remake what was already there. We refine it, we forget parts of it, and remember others, not with words, but with wrists, with grip, with rhythm. Even now, new tools bloom from fingers tapping glass, but they follow the same pattern. A puzzle, a problem, a shape in the mind seeking form. The same ancient dance, performed on a different stage. So when we look across the history of Ice Age tools, from blunt flakes to balanced spear throwers, from woven traps to carved amulets, what we are seeing is not progress in the modern sense. We are seeing participation. The hand, again and again, entering into dialogue with its world, asking, what is possible here? And we too are part of that dialogue. We carry the questions forward. We shape what's next with what was given, not as isolated minds, but as the latest hands in a lineage of remembering. The final flake falls. The tool is finished, but the story is not, because the hand remembers, and it always will. Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for walking this long road through the ice with me, through ash-marked hearths, mammoth bone shelters, woven fibers, and the gentle memory of the hand that never forgets. If this story helped you feel the hush of ancient evenings, stirred wonder at the memory held in stone, or invited focus in a world too quick to forget, then I'm deeply grateful for your time, your listening, your presence here. I wonder what part of this journey will remain with you. Was it a particular shape, a spark in the dark, a tool that seemed to hum with memory? Whether it was the image of hands binding fibers in silence, the quiet presence of mammoth bone rings in the snow, or the enduring sense of stone passed from one mind to another, these fragments are what tether us across time, weaving the old with the now. If any moment lingered, if a thought surfaced or a memory stirred, I invite you to share it in the comments below. It becomes a quiet offering, part of the slow, thoughtful mosaic we're building together. And if you'd like to walk further with us, through lost paths, buried echoes, and the dreams of future tools, feel free to like, share, or subscribe. There are still stories waiting beneath the dust. Until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful,